Hey, you made it. Wherever you are right now, tucked under a blanket lying on your side, maybe staring at the ceiling with your phone balanced on your chest, I am really glad you're here tonight. Pull the covers a little closer. Let the day go. Because for the next little while we're going somewhere together. Somewhere old, somewhere quiet, somewhere that will make you look at the road outside your window in an entirely different way by the time we're done. Picture this. You wake up one morning and every highway in America is just gone. Not destroyed, not blown up, just slowly swallowed by weeds pushing up through the asphalt, by mud filling the cracks, by forests creeping in from the sides inch by inch, year by year, until the road that used to take you to the grocery store is nothing but a faint scar in the earth that nobody can quite remember. No interstate system, no county roads, no Google Maps pointing you anywhere because there is nowhere left to point. Now imagine that feeling lasting not for a week, not for a year, but for over 500 years. That is exactly what happened to Europe, and the story of how people slowly, stubbornly, painfully rebuilt, using nothing but their bare hands, their faith, their animals, and their hunger to connect with one another, is one of the most remarkable and most quietly forgotten stories in all of human history. Tonight, we begin that story. Before we go any further, if this kind of storytelling is the reason you keep coming back at night, then you already know what to do. Hit that like button, leave a comment, share this with a friend who could use something good to fall asleep to. And hey, I am genuinely curious, where are you watching this from tonight? Tell me in the comments. Are you in bed already on the couch? Is it raining outside? I love hearing from you. Now go ahead and dim that screen just a little more. Maybe put on a soft fan or let the quiet settle in around you. Let the story carry you. Let us go back. All the way back. At the height of the Roman Empire around the 2nd century, Rome had built something that the ancient world had never seen and would not see again for over 1,000 years. More than 85,000 kilometers of paved stone roads. Let that number sit with you for a moment. 85,000 kilometers. Stone paved, engineered, drained, maintained, stretching from the cold shores of Scotland all the way down through France, across Spain, through North Africa, up through the Middle East, and deep into the heart of what is now Turkey and Iraq. A Roman general in the 3rd century could calculate almost to the day how long it would take to move his army from Cologne to Rome, 67 days. Rome to the southern port of Brindisi, 57 days. Rome all the way to Syria, 124 days, including 2 days at sea. These were not rough estimates, these were schedules, because the roads made them possible. The roads were the empire. They were the nervous system, the blood vessels, the breathing lungs of the entire Roman world. Without them, no army could respond to a distant rebellion in time. No tax collector could reach the frontier provinces. No merchant could predict when his grain would arrive. No message could travel faster than a man on foot stumbling through a muddy forest path. The roads were not just infrastructure. They were civilization itself poured into stone and stretched across a continent. And then in the year 476, the Western Roman Empire collapsed. Now historians will tell you correctly that Rome did not fall in a single dramatic moment. It was a slow unravelling stretched across decades, even centuries. Barbarian kingdoms rising, tax revenues drying up, the army shrinking, the emperors growing weaker. But here is the part that tends to get lost in the grand narrative of empires rising and falling. When Rome lost the ability to maintain its roads, something very specific happened to millions of ordinary people. They became stuck. Not metaphorically stuck, literally physically stuck. A farmer in what is now central France who had once been able to load his cart and travel to a market town 2 days away, he could no longer do that safely. The road was breaking apart. The bridges were rotting. Nobody was fixing them because the system that had organised and funded road repair simply did not exist anymore. A village in what is now England that had once received regular deliveries of goods from distant regions, salt pottery tools, slowly found itself cut off. The road that connected it to the wider world disappeared under mud and grass and time. One Roman historian described roads that had once been smooth enough to travel by chariot at a swift pace, now reduced to muddy tracks that swallowed wagon wheels up to the axle. Europe was not conquered by a great enemy. In many ways it was simply disconnected. Now I want you to really feel this, because this is the part of medieval history that most people never quite grasp. Medieval Europe was not one place. It was thousands of tiny isolated places separated from each other, not by oceans or mountain ranges, but by something far more ordinary and far more relentless: mud, forest, and silence. Most of Central Europe in the early medieval period, roughly from 300 to 1200, was covered in dense, unbroken forest. Not the tidy, managed woodlands you might walk through today. These were vast, dark, wolf-haunted forests that stretched for hundreds of kilometres without a single clearing. Wolves were not a fairy tale danger. They were real. They were everywhere. Medieval people genuinely believed that wolves were poisonous, that even their bite carried a venom which tells you something about how terrifying and ever-present these animals were in the imagination and the daily reality of ordinary life. Beyond the wolves there were the rivers. Without Roman bridges to cross them, a river was not just a natural feature of the landscape. It was a wall, a boundary, a thing that stopped you. And then there was the mud. Spring in medieval Europe was not a season of renewal. It was a season of paralysis. The ground thawed and dissolved into something like quicksand. Heavily loaded carts would sink up to their axles. Horses could break a leg stepping into a hidden rut. A journey that took 2 days in summer could stretch to 2 weeks in April if it was possible at all. Historians have a term for this. They call it the spring mud season. And for about half of Europe's medieval population, the spring mud season was simply the season when you stayed home and waited. Here is something that I think is genuinely extraordinary. After Rome fell, most people in Europe did not travel more than 30 kilometres from the place they were born in their entire lives. 30 kilometres. Think about your morning commute. Most of us cover more than that distance without a second thought. We drive it half awake listening to a podcast stopping for coffee. For a medieval peasant, 30 kilometres might represent the outer boundary of their entire known world. The next village over was familiar. The town 2 valleys away was somewhat foreign. The city 3 days' walk away was as distant and exotic as another country. And this was not just inconvenient. It reshaped everything about medieval life: how people thought, how they spoke, how they worshipped, what they ate, who they married, who they feared. Dialects developed so rapidly in isolated communities that people living 70 kilometres apart could barely understand each other. Regional foods evolved based on whatever happened to grow locally, because importing anything from a distance was extraordinary. Disease spread unevenly, killing one village and somehow sparing the next, simply because of how little movement passed between them. The absence of roads did not just make travel harder, it made people smaller. But here is the part of this story that I find most moving. Human beings cannot bear isolation for very long. Even without roads, even without maps, even without any centralized authority telling them to do so, people kept moving. They carved paths through the forests with their feet. They forded rivers at the shallowest spots again and again, wearing grooves in the riverbed stone. They followed the ridgelines above the mud where the ground was firmer. They traced the routes of migratory animals because animals instinctively find the easiest path through difficult terrain. And slowly over generations, something remarkable began to emerge from all of this accidental navigation. A new network. not as grand as Rome's, not engineered by surveyors with instruments, not paved with carefully fitted stone laid over 4 distinct layers of foundation material, but real and alive, and shaped not by the ambitions of emperors, but by the everyday hunger of ordinary people, farmers wanting to reach the market, mothers wanting to visit their daughters in the next village, pilgrims wanting to find something holy, merchants willing to risk everything for the chance of a good trade. The medieval road was not a Roman road rebuilt. It was something entirely different. It was a living, breathing, constantly evolving thing, more like a river finding its way to the sea than like an engineer drawing a line on a map. And the story of how it grew, how it was built, who built it, who paid for it, who suffered for it, and what extraordinary places it eventually connected, that is what we are here to explore tonight. We have just seen the world that medieval Europe inherited. A world of broken stone roads slowly being swallowed by grass and time. A world of isolated villages separated by forest and mud. A world where 30 kilometers might as well be the edge of the earth. But here is what I want you to carry with you as we go deeper. Every single path that was eventually carved through that wilderness started with one person. One pair of feet choosing a direction. One set of wagon wheels pressing into soft earth for the first time, and being followed the next day by someone else, and the day after that by someone else again, until the track was there, real and permanent, pressed into the ground by the weight of 10,000 ordinary journeys. So who are these people who actually did the work, who dragged the stones, dug the drainage ditches, laid the wooden planks across the swamp, and kept the paths from vanishing back into the earth? The answer might surprise you, because it was not the kings, it was not the knights, and it definitely was not the people who benefited most from having good roads. Stay with me, because next we're going inside the feudal system, and we're going to meet the invisible architects of the medieval world, the people who built Europe's roads with their bare hands, who had no choice in the matter, and whose names history never thought to write down. So we left off with a question hanging in the air. If it was not the kings, if it was not the knights, then who really built the roads of medieval Europe? Let me take you somewhere specific before I answer that. A Tuesday morning, somewhere in rural England, around the year 1250. The sun has barely cleared the tree line. Mist is still sitting low over the fields. A man, let us call him Thomas, because we do not know his actual name, and history forgot to write it down, has been awake since before dawn. He has already milked his 2 goats. He has eaten a small bowl of something that might charitably be described as porridge. His wife has packed him a piece of hard bread and a bit of salted fish wrapped in a cloth. And now, instead of walking to his own narrow strip of farmland to tend the barley that his family depends on to survive the winter, Thomas is walking the other direction entirely. He has been summoned by the lord of the manor, not for battle, not for some grand adventure. The lord wants the road between the village and the market town repaired before the merchants come through next week. And so Thomas, who does not particularly want to repair a road today, whose barley genuinely needs attention, and who has not been asked so much as informed, picks up a wooden-handled mattock and he goes. This was not an unusual morning in medieval Europe. The system that sent Thomas out to work on that road had a name, the corvée. Pronounced, if you're curious, something like corvoy. It was a form of labour tax not paid in coins, not paid in crops, but paid in time, in sweat, in days of your life handed over without compensation to whoever held power above you. The word itself drifts all the way back to ancient Rome, where citizens performed what they called opera publica, public works in lieu of paying certain taxes, repairing roads, maintaining bridges, keeping drainage ditches clear. When Rome's centralized administration collapsed, that system did not simply vanish. It transformed. It filtered down through the layers of feudal society and became something both more personal and in many ways more inescapable. Under medieval feudalism, peasants owed their lord a fixed number of days of labour every year. The regular expected work, tending his fields, threshing his grain, hauling his firewood, was called opera riga. But there was also a second category. When the lord needed something extra done, something beyond the usual calendar of duties, he could demand what was called opera corrugata, requisitioned labour. And one of the most common uses for that requisitioned labour was roads. Think about that framing for a moment. A road was not a public good in medieval Europe the way we might think of it today. It was in a very real sense a feudal demand. The lord needed the road passable. The lord had people below him who owed him labour, so the road got built, or more accurately repaired, by the people who could least afford to leave their own work undone. Now I want to be careful here because it is very easy to paint the medieval corvée in the darkest possible colours, and history sometimes tempts us toward that kind of simplicity. The truth is more complicated and honestly more interesting. Yes, the system was coercive. There is no way around that. A serf or villain in medieval England could not simply decide one morning that he had better things to do than drag stones to the road. Refusal had consequences, fines at the manor court, loss of access to common land, the kind of petty but grinding punishment that a lord could make your life considerably more miserable with. The relationship between lord and peasant was not a partnership of equals choosing to work together. But here is what I find fascinating. The corvée was not unlimited. It was governed by custom, and in medieval Europe custom was something close to law, perhaps even more powerful than law in some cases, because it was what people had always done, and people knew when it was being violated. Manorial records from England, those extraordinary meticulous documents that monks and estate managers kept recording every bushel of grain and every day of labour on a given manor, show that the number of corvée days owed was typically fixed and recognised. In many English manors of the 13th century, a villein owed somewhere between 2 and 3 days of labour per week on the lord's land throughout the year, with additional days during harvest and ploughing season. Road work would come out of the general obligation, but it was tracked. It was counted. This meant that when a man like Thomas spent Tuesday repairing the market road, the lord's reeve, a kind of estate manager, often himself a peasant, who'd been elevated to the position of supervisor, kept a record of it. The day was owed. The day was rendered. And Thomas, in theory at least, was now 1 day closer to having fulfilled his annual obligation. But let's get back to the road itself, because I think this is where the story becomes truly remarkable, and where most people's mental image of medieval road building falls completely apart. We tend to imagine medieval road workers as a kind of organised labour force men marching out in formation with a plan and a purpose, building something deliberate and structured. The reality was considerably more improvised, and considerably more human. Road maintenance in medieval Europe was almost never about building something new from scratch. It was about fighting a constant, exhausting, largely losing battle against the landscape itself. The primary enemies were 3: mud, vegetation and water. Mud we have already discussed. But consider for a moment what mud actually meant for a medieval road surface. A dirt track that had been perfectly functional in August, hard-packed, navigable, almost pleasant, could become after 2 weeks of autumn rain something that swallowed cartwheels that horses would slip on, and sometimes fall in that travellers would sink into up to their ankles with every step. And it did not stay bad. It got worse. Each cart that struggled through the soft ground cut deeper ruts, each rut filled with water. The water softened the earth further. By the time winter properly arrived, what had been a road was simply a long, irregular wound in the ground. The primary repair technique was not sophisticated. It was frankly whatever was closest at hand. In regions with good local stone parts of northern England, sections of France near old Roman quarries, certain areas of Germany workers would fill ruts and soft spots with broken stone. Not carved or fitted stone, just broken rock roughly smashed and thrown into the gap. The passage of heavy carts would grind it down and settle it into the mud, creating a surface that was at least better than nothing. In areas where stone was scarce or too far to transport, and you have to remember that transporting heavy stone without a proper road to carry it on was its own circular problem. Workers used what they could find. Bundles of brushwood and sticks tied together and laid across the soft ground, creating a kind of rough corduroy surface. Gravel scooped from nearby riverbeds, sand, ash from burned fields. Whatever worked for long enough that the Lord Steward would stop complaining. In the wetlands and fenlands of places like East Anglia in England, or the marshy flatlands of Flanders in what is now Belgium, medieval road builders developed something genuinely clever, the causey or causeway, a raised earthen bank sometimes topped with timber planks, sometimes faced with packed stone that lifted the roadbed above the worst of the waterlogged ground. Some of these medieval causeways still exist as the foundations of modern roads. You drive over them today and do not know it. I want to tell you about King Edward I of England. Not because he was a particularly sympathetic character, history remembers him as a formidable and often brutal ruler, but because he did something that I think reveals a great deal about how medieval people actually thought about roads. In the year 1285, Edward issued what became known as the Statute of Winchester. It was primarily a law about crime and local order, but buried in its text was a road provision that, once you understand it, tells you everything about the dangers of medieval travel. The statute commanded that all major highways between market towns be widened, not just repaired, widened, and it specified very precisely why there must be no ditch underwood or bushes where someone could hide with evil intent within 200 feet of the road on either side. 200 feet. Think about what that means. Medieval England's main highways, the roads that connected towns that merchants travelled with their goods, that travellers used on important journeys, were apparently so closely hemmed in by vegetation, so enclosed by untrimmed hedgerows and encroaching woodland that armed men could conceal themselves practically next to the road surface and ambush passers-by without anyone seeing them coming. And Edward's legal solution was not to send an army to patrol the roads. It was to make the local lord legally responsible for clearing his section of roadside. If a robbery occurred on a stretch of road where the underwood had not been cut back, the lord was financially liable. If someone was killed, the lord faced the king's displeasure directly. Suddenly, road maintenance was not just a practical matter. It was a matter of personal legal exposure for every landowner in England. I find this deeply human. Not the violence of it, but the pragmatism. Medieval people were not naive about what their roads were. They were dangerous corridors through an even more dangerous landscape. The decision to travel them was never taken lightly. Let me ask you something, and I mean this genuinely. When was the last time you thought about a road, the actual physical road, not the traffic on it, as something that someone had to make a decision to build? We move through roads every day as though they simply exist, as though they were always there, as though the ground just naturally arranged itself into convenient paths between places we needed to go. Medieval people did not have that luxury. Every stretch of improved road they used was the direct result of somebody's labour, usually somebody who had not chosen to provide it, usually somebody who had other things they desperately needed to be doing. And yet the roads got made, and the roads got used, and the roads in turn made other things possible: trade, medicine, communication, community, that would not have existed without them. There is something quietly profound in that. The infrastructure of civilization was for most of human history built on the unrecompensed backs of people whose names we will never know. The corvée eventually evolved. Over the course of the later medieval period, as money economies developed and the rigid structures of early feudalism began to loosen, lords increasingly accepted cash payments in lieu of labour days. A serf might pay a small fee to avoid road work during a crucial week of the harvest. Towns and boroughs began developing their own systems for road maintenance, collecting tolls from travellers and using the money to hire workers rather than drafting local peasants. In France, the system of forced road labour became so institutionalised that it was still being formally administered as late as the 18th century, when it became one of the genuine social grievances that helped fuel the revolution. But in England, from roughly the 12th through the 14th centuries, the picture is remarkably consistent. Roads were made by the people who lived near them, under obligation to the people who owned the land around them, using whatever materials were closest to hand in whatever time could be squeezed around the edges of the agricultural calendar that governed every other aspect of their existence. It was imperfect. It was often inadequate. Travellers complained bitterly about English roads throughout the entire medieval period. There are accounts of carts overturning, horses breaking legs in hidden ruts, travellers taking hours to cover distances that should have taken minutes. But the roads existed. In spite of everything, they existed. And as I think about Thomas, our invented Thomas, who packed his hard bread that Tuesday morning and went to shift stones on the market road instead of tending his own barley, I find myself wanting to say something that history almost never says. He built something. Not the lord who ordered it, not the king whose law required it, not the merchant who would ride along it next week dry-shod without a second thought for how it came to be passable. Thomas, whose name we do not know, whose face we have never seen, whose children's names and troubles and small joys were never written down anywhere at all. He built something that lasted, and he was not alone. Across medieval Europe, tens of thousands of people just like Thomas were doing exactly the same kind of invisible, unrecognized, absolutely essential work. In France, in Germany, in the low-lying, eternally waterlogged Netherlands, where the very ground itself seemed to resist the idea of roads. In Scotland, where the terrain was so rugged that some routes required not just labour, but genuine engineering ingenuity, laid into the hillsides by people who had never studied engineering in any formal sense. The road network that slowly, painfully, imperfectly emerged from the medieval centuries was not the product of any single plan or any single ruler. It was the accumulated result of millions of ordinary mornings, millions of small reluctant acts of labour, countless handfuls of gravel thrown into countless muddy ruts by countless forgotten hands. Which brings me to the thing that still astonishes me every time I think about it. All of that labour, all of those hours and backs and cold mornings was for the most part directed by compulsion, by the structure of a society that treated most of its members as instruments rather than as people with their own desires and priorities. And yet somehow, somewhere in that coerced and imperfect system, something extraordinary was taking shape. Because while the corvée built the functional road, the muddy, barely adequate, frequently dangerous but technically passable track between village and market town, something else entirely was building the grander paths. The paths that would eventually connect not just neighbouring villages, but entire regions, entire countries. The paths that would in time stitch the whole scattered, isolated, fragmented landscape of medieval Europe back into something that felt, however faintly, like connection. And those paths were not being built by serfs under obligation. They were being built by people who chose to walk them, people who walked out their front doors with a staff in one hand and a prayer on their lips and the distant horizon in their eyes and just kept going. Stay with me. because the story of those paths and the extraordinary human hunger that carved them into the landscape is where this journey takes us next. There is a place in the county of Dorset on the southern coast of England that I want you to picture. Not a castle, not a cathedral, not any of the grand monuments that history tends to point you toward. Just a lane that has sunk so deeply into the earth over so many centuries that when you walk along it, the ground on either side rises above your head. Tree roots hang out of the earthen walls like the fingers of something half buried and reaching. The branches of the trees that grow along the banks have stretched inward toward each other across the gap, and over time they have woven together into a canopy so dense, so complete, that you're no longer walking on a path through a landscape. You're walking inside the landscape, inside the earth itself almost. The sky reduced to a narrow strip of light high above you, framed by roots and stone, and centuries of quietly accumulating darkness. In some places along this lane, the ground level outside the path sits 20 feet above your head. 20 feet. The lane has a name that I love unreasonably, Hell Lane. And the thing about Hell Lane that makes it extraordinary is not its depth or its age or even its slightly ominous name, though all of those things do contribute to the effect. What makes it extraordinary is this: no one built it. Not one person, not one crew of workers, not one lord with a plan and a workforce pressed into service. Hell Lane is what happens when enough human beings walk the same path for long enough. It is infrastructure created by nothing more than repetition. By the accumulation of footstep upon footstep upon footstep across more centuries than we can comfortably hold in our minds, until the very stone of the earth has given way. These sunken paths have a name. Two names actually, one ordinary, one almost poetic. The ordinary name is Sunken Lane. The poetic one, the one I prefer and the one that has been used in southern England for about 1,000 years, is Holloway. It comes from the Old English words holloweg, meaning simply a sunken road, a harrowed path, a way worn below the level of everything around it. Holloways are found across the softstone counties of southern England, the chalk of Kent and East Anglia, the golden sandstone of Dorset and Somerset, the green sand of Surrey and Sussex. They exist because in those places the bedrock yields, it gives. Pound it with enough hooves and cartwheels and leather soles over enough generations, and it does not resist, it descends. In France they are called chemins creux, hollow roads. In Germany they appear as Hohlweg, threading through forested hillsides. You find them across Europe wherever the ground is soft enough and the history is old enough, which in much of the continent means you find them everywhere you look once you know what you're seeing. The oldest holloways in Britain date to the early Iron Age, which means some of these paths have been in continuous use, worn deeper, with every passing year for roughly 3,000 years. The most recent of them are at least 300 years old. There are no young holloways. You cannot rush a holloway into existence. They are by their very nature a measure of time made tangible. Here is how a holloway is born. And I want you to follow this slowly because the process is one of the more meditative things I've come across in all the time I have spent thinking about medieval roads. It begins with a slope. Usually a gentle one, not a cliff, not a dramatic descent, but a long persistent grade that coaxes water to flow in a particular direction when it rains. Someone at some point needs to walk up or down that slope. Perhaps they are driving cattle from a valley pasture to higher summer grazing. Perhaps they are carrying grain to a mill or walking to a church in the next village. They choose the easiest line down the hill. Animals are particularly good at this, and in many cases it was the animals, not the people, who made the original choice. Sheep especially have an instinct for finding the path of least resistance through a landscape that would take a human engineer months to calculate. That first person, or that first sheep, presses a shallow groove into the soft ground. The rain comes and runs along the groove because water follows the lowest point. The groove deepens slightly. Another person walks through it and deepens it a little more. Another rain, Another traveller, another season. Decades pass. The groove has become a track. The track has become a lane. The lane has a slight depression that collects water in autumn, making it muddy, making travellers step to the slightly higher edges to avoid the mud. Those edges are pressed down too. The whole lane widens and sinks simultaneously. Centuries pass now. The lane has sunk several feet below the surrounding fields. The drainage ditches dug along either side to keep it passable during wet seasons have their own internal erosion. Hedge trees were planted along the banks generations ago, partly as windbreaks, partly as living fences, partly as markers so that travellers could find the lane when fog rolled in from the sea. Those trees have grown enormous. Their roots stabilise the earthen walls and prevent collapse, which means the lane can sink further without the sides caving in. More centuries, more feet, more wheels, more rain. And eventually you arrive at Hell Lane 20 feet below the fields, a tunnel of root and stone and ancient compressed darkness, so narrow in places that two horses cannot pass each other, so deep that in winter the sun never reaches the floor. What I find remarkable, genuinely quietly remarkable, is that this process required no decision, no plan, no authority. No one with a title or a purse full of silver commissioned a Holloway. No lord stood at the top of a hill and announced that a sunken lane would be excavated here according to these dimensions by these workers on this schedule. The Holloway is pure democracy of movement, pure accumulated need. Every person who ever walked it contributed exactly their own small invisible fraction to its making. The shepherd who drove his flock through it in the year 800 deposited perhaps an inch of compaction across a season of passage. The merchant's cart in the year 1100 carved its ruts a little deeper. The pilgrim in the year 1300, walking with a staff toward a distant saint's shrine, pressed the sandstone floor another imperceptible fraction downward. None of them knew they were building something. None of them thought of themselves as road builders. They were just going somewhere, and the going multiplied by centuries of other goings made the road. Now pause here with me for a second. Have you ever walked a path in a park or a field? Not a paved path, just a dirt trail that clearly did not exist on any official map, but had obviously been walked so many times that the grass was simply gone. And you knew without anyone telling you that this path had been created by thousands of people, all making the same reasonable decision independently, that this way was more convenient or more direct or more pleasant than the official route. What you were walking was a Holloway in its infancy, a Holloway 30 years old instead of 3,000. The human impulse that created those informal paths through city parks in the 21st century is the exact same impulse that created Hell Lane in the dark centuries after Rome. We go where it makes sense to go. We follow each other. We wear away the ground beneath us one step at a time without ever intending to. And the ground being softer than we are eventually gives way. Holloways were not just curiosities of the landscape. In medieval England, they were the primary means by which most ordinary rural travel happened. Think about what they offered. A Holloway that had sunk 6 or 8 feet below the surrounding fields was sheltered from wind in a way that open roads almost never were. The earthen walls held warmth from the sun, making them noticeably warmer in autumn and early spring. The overhanging tree canopy provided shelter from rain at least partially. The enclosed nature of the path made it easier to keep livestock together. Animals tended not to stray out of a lane when there was a 6-foot wall on either side. For livestock specifically, the Holloway was ideal. Drovers moving cattle or sheep from upland summer grazing to winter lowland pastures, or from farm to market, needed paths that were wide enough for a small herd, but contained enough that the animals did not scatter. Holloways provided exactly that a kind of natural chute through the countryside deepened by generations of the very animals it was designed to carry. The Welsh drovers who were moving cattle from the mountains of Wales into the markets of central and southern England from at least the 12th century onward knew every holloway, every ford, every grass verge between their route and London with an intimacy that no map could replicate because there were no maps. Their knowledge lived in the bodies of their animals and the calluses of their feet. A drover who had made the journey 12 times knew which holloway flooded in November, which one was too narrow for a bullock of a certain size, which one had an old beech tree fallen across it that you had to go around. This knowledge passed from drover to drover, father to son, neighbour to neighbour, worn into bodies the same way the paths were worn into stone. There is a specific holloway in Dorset I want to tell you about because it illustrates something that I think is genuinely astonishing about how medieval paths were used. Shoots Lane near the village of Simonsbury on the coast of West Dorset cuts inland from the sea through several miles of sandstone landscape. It was likely used at its height to carry salt fish and other coastal goods from the harbour up to inland settlements. Salt, we will talk about salt routes properly another time because they deserve their own story, was one of the most essential commodities of medieval life, and fish preserved in salt was one of the primary proteins available to people who lived more than a day's walk from the coast. People walked Shoots Lane in both directions for perhaps 500 or 600 years during the medieval period. They walked it in summer heat and winter mud. They walked it at dawn to make the tidal markets in time and at dusk when the light was almost gone. They walked it when they were healthy and when they were not, when the load was manageable and when it was brutal. And now standing in Shoots Lane today, if you can find it, and it requires some searching, some willingness to push through overgrown nettles and force your way past brambles that have closed in over centuries of disuse, you are standing in a trench 6 feet deep that those men and women created without ever meaning to, without a single day's work directed specifically at making it. That is extraordinary. I want to offer you a thought that I've been sitting with for a while, and I am genuinely curious what you think. We tend to separate in our minds the things people deliberately build from the things that simply happen. Architecture goes in one category, intentional, designed, purposeful. Erosion goes in another, accidental, natural, unminded. But holloways refuse that separation. They are the product of intention. Millions of separate intentions, each individual and purposeful, each one representing a specific person, going somewhere for a specific reason, that accumulated over generations into something none of those individuals planned or foresaw. They are built by intention without design, created without creators. I find this one of the most genuinely moving things in all of medieval history, and I am aware that might sound like an odd thing to say about a sunken lane in Dorset. But the holloway is proof that infrastructure does not require authority. It does not require planning or investment or political will. It requires only need and enough time and enough people willing to act on that need. Meanwhile, 2 countries away in Spain, something entirely different was happening with paths shaped by animal movement, and it operated on a scale that would have astonished even the most ambitious Roman road engineer. The Mesta was a medieval guild of sheep herders formerly established by the Castilian king Alfonso X in the year 1273, though the practice it organised was considerably older. The Mesta managed something called transhumance, the seasonal migration of vast flocks of sheep between summer pastures in the cool mountains of the north and winter, grazing in the warm southern plains. Not hundreds of sheep, not thousands. At its height, the Mesta's annual migrations involved somewhere between 2 and 3 million sheep, moving twice a year, across routes that could stretch 400 miles from end to end. The roads those sheep travelled were called cañadas, a word that simply means path for livestock. But the major routes, the ones with royal protection and legal status, were the Cañadas Reals royal drove roads. The Leonesa route alone ran 350 to 450 miles connecting the summer pastures around Leon and Soria to the winter lowlands of Extremadura and Andalusia. The sheep travelled it at a pace of roughly 10 to 12 miles per day, taking more than a month each way. These were not informal accidental paths. They were legally defined, legally protected, legally enforced. Royal decrees specified that a cañada reel had to be at least 250 feet wide enough for a substantial flock to move without pressure, wide enough that the animals could graze a little as they walked, wide enough that if a farmer had planted crops too close to the edge, there was no ambiguity about who had violated whose rights. Landowners whose fields encroached on a cañada reel faced serious legal consequences. The roads were marked. They were maintained. They were in every meaningful sense public infrastructure except that the public in question was not human travellers. It was sheep, and those sheep walking the same routes for centuries did not create holloways the way their English counterparts did. The Spanish bedrock was harder, the terrain different, the paths maintained at a specific width. But they created something else, a network of ecological corridors through the landscape that is still legally protected today. 500 years after the Mesta's influences faded, the Cañadas Reales still exist as a mapped, surveyed, legally acknowledged network of paths across the Iberian Peninsula. You can walk them now. Some still carry flocks twice a year in a practice kept alive as much by cultural pride as by economic necessity. The medieval sheep roads of Spain never sank below the surface of the earth the way the English holloways did, but they shaped the landscape just as permanently. Here is what I keep coming back to whenever I think about holloways and drovers' roads and all the other paths that medieval people wore into the landscape without quite meaning to. Every road in history began as a decision, not a grand decision, not a decision made in a palace by someone with a title. Just someone standing at the edge of a forest or at the top of a slope or at the bank of a river and choosing a direction. That is all. One person, one direction, one step. And then another person later choosing the same direction, and another after that, and another. Until the direction was no longer a choice, it was a fact. A physical, undeniable fact pressed into the surface of the earth. The holloways of Dorset are in that sense not just ancient roads, they are time made visible. They are the record of millions of small ordinary decisions preserved in stone, waiting for you to add your own footstep to the story. Which raises a question I want to plant in your mind because we will be coming back to it from a very different angle very shortly. If the paths that emerge from repetition and need were built by everyone without anyone in charge, what happened when someone actually sat down and said we need to build something specific in a specific place, using specific materials, and it needs to last? What happened when medieval builders moved from the accidental to the deliberate, from the lane worn by 1,000 anonymous boots to the road laid stone by hand in the cold with purpose? That story is entirely different. And it involves materials, tools, methods, and a kind of quiet engineering genius that had been almost completely forgotten. The stone, the wood, the mud, and the water. The three languages of medieval road building, and the people who spoke them fluently without ever having attended a single class in their lives. Right before we go further, I want to tell you something that genuinely surprised me the first time I learned it. In the year 2022, construction workers in central Berlin were laying new power and gas lines beneath a busy modern street, Stralauer Strasse. For those who know the city when their equipment hit something unexpected about 8 feet underground. Not a pipe, not a cable, not the usual tangle of buried modern infrastructure. Wood, old wood, very old wood. 3 distinct layers of it carefully arranged lying in the dark beneath centuries of accumulated city. Archaeologists were called in. Tree ring dating was performed, and what those workers had found preserved almost perfectly by a thick layer of peat that had sealed it airtight for over 700 years was a medieval wooden causeway built around the year 1238, made of oak pine and birch trunks, the same trees that had grown in the forest surrounding the young city of Berlin, laid in 3 careful layers across the soft, waterlogged ground near the river Spree. The causeway was 50 metres long and 6 metres wide. The top layer was debarked trunks laid side by side across the direction of travel like an enormous ribbed mat. Beneath that, 3 parallel beams running lengthwise along the road, and beneath those a foundation of thick, roughly worked logs invisible to anyone who'd ever walked on it, but doing the structural work that kept the whole thing from sinking into the mud. Where the surface planks had gaps or weaknesses the builders had packed in fieldstones. Not carved, not shaped, just grabbed from wherever was closest, jammed into the holes doing the job. The German Senator for Culture who saw this discovery called it, with slightly endearing bureaucratic restraint, a real hit. The state archaeologist called it a real sensation. And honestly, both of them were right. That causeway under Berlin is in miniature the story of medieval road engineering. Not glamorous, not grand in the way that Roman roads were grand, but deeply, practically intelligently responsive to a very specific problem, in this case, wet ground near a river in a young city that needed people to be able to move across it reliably. The builders of that causeway were not engineers with degrees. They were not following a textbook or consulting a set of established plans. They were woodsmen and labourers who understood from experience and observation what wood did when you laid it on wet ground, what happened to logs when you buried them in peat, which tree species rotted quickly and which ones held up, and how many layers you needed to distribute the weight of a loaded cart evenly enough that it would not break through. That knowledge, tacit practical, passed from hand to hand and eye to eye over generations, is the lost language of medieval road building. And I want to spend some time tonight trying to recover a little of it. Medieval road builders worked, as I said at the end of our last section, in 3 primary materials. 3 languages each with its own grammar, its own strengths, its own regional vocabulary shaped by what the local landscape had to offer. The first language was wood. Wood was the oldest engineering material available. The tradition of building paths through wet and difficult ground using timber predates medieval Europe by an almost incomprehensible margin. In the Somerset levels of southwestern England, that extraordinary flat wetland landscape, where the land barely rises above sea level and the ground in winter is more water than earth, archaeologists excavating peat bogs beginning in the 1970s found something that stopped them in their tracks: a wooden walkway, preserved in the waterlogged peat with almost unbelievable completeness. Oak planks up to 3 meters long and 40 centimeters wide, cut from trees that were themselves 400 years old, laid end to end and anchored by crossed wooden pegs driven into the underlying peat at angles, forming a kind of massive primitive stitch through the marsh. Tree ring dating placed its construction in the winter of 3807 or 3806 before the Common Era. That is nearly 6,000 years ago. This sweet track, named with charming practicality for the peat cutter, Ray Sweet, who discovered it in 1973, is one of the oldest known engineered roads in the world. It predates the pyramids of Egypt. It connects what was then an island at Westhay to higher ground roughly 1 mile away, spanning a reed swamp that would otherwise have been completely impassable. What I want you to sit with is not just the age of it, it is the engineering intelligence of it. The builders of the Sweet Track did not simply throw logs into a swamp. They selected different tree species for different structural functions: oak for the load-bearing planks because of its hardness, hazel and alder for the flexible longitudinal rails, because those species bent without splitting, ash and lime for the pegs, because they could be driven into wet peat without shattering. They cut notches in the planks to fit precisely over the crossed pegs so that the whole structure interlocked, This was done with stone axes, wooden wedges, wooden mallets, no metal, no surveying instruments, no architectural drawings, just hands and eyes, and an understanding of materials that had been accumulating in that community for longer than we can comfortably imagine. Jump forward nearly 5,000 years and medieval builders in Northern Europe were working in the same tradition. The fundamental insight that logs laid perpendicular to the direction of travel over soft ground created a surface strong enough to carry weight that would otherwise sink had not changed. What changed over centuries of accumulated experience was the refinement of the technique. The medieval builders in northern Germany and the Low Countries areas that are, geologically speaking, essentially a very flat argument between land and water, became extraordinarily skilled at wooden road construction. Archaeological evidence from the region shows multi-layered structures with extraordinary complexity. Foundation logs of specific dimensions cross timbers at particular intervals, calculated to distribute weight evenly. Surface planks selected for specific hardness and grain orientation, and they maintain these roads. That is the detail that most impresses me. The same wooden roads were repaired and rebuilt over generations. Archaeologists examining bog roads from medieval northern Germany found evidence of multiple construction phases on a single road. Newer logs laid over older ones that had begun to rot patches of replacement material fitted precisely into gaps. Structural corrections made when subsidence had tilted a section. Someone generations after the original road was built walked out into a bog with new timber and fixed a road they had not made and never owned because that road needed fixing, and they were the ones who were there. The second language was stone. And here is where I want to correct something that I think most people instinctively get wrong about medieval roads and stone. We tend to assume that stone paving was the medieval ideal, that if medieval builders had their way, every road would have been neatly cobbled from end to end. And then we assume that the failure to achieve this ideal was purely a matter of resources and labour. If only they had had more money and more workers, everything would have been paved. That assumption misreads both the material and the period. Stone paving was not universally desirable. In many circumstances, particularly for roads used primarily by loaded pack animals, a stone surface was actually a significant problem. Horses and mules on steep stone-paved slopes slipped. Particularly in wet weather, smooth stone became treacherous. Pack horses carrying heavy goods across a stone-paved mountain pass in rain could lame themselves on a single wrong step. Gravel surfaces had real advantages over stone in these situations. Gravel compacted under weight but provided grip. It absorbed some of the shock that stone transmitted directly to hooves. It was self-healing in a limited sense. If a cartwheel or a hoof displaced gravel from one spot, it could be raked back. And gravel was in most parts of Europe essentially free. It lay in riverbeds and along stream banks in almost unlimited quantities, requiring only the labour to transport it. So when medieval builders chose to surface a road with gravel rather than stone, that was often not a failure of ambition. It was a considered technical choice. Stone paving was reserved for specific situations, the approaches to bridges and fords where concentrated traffic on soft ground could destroy an earthen bank in a season. Mountain passes where the underlying rock was already close to the surface, and carving a path through it was more efficient than hauling in material. Town centres and market squares where the volume of foot traffic and cart traffic would reduce a gravel surface to dust or mud within weeks. The areas immediately outside city gates and the junctions of major routes where wear was concentrated and maintenance difficult. Medieval England provides some particularly good documentary evidence for how stone was used selectively in road building. The town of Abingdon in the summer of the year 1416 set 300 men to work digging drainage ditches and constructing a causeway across its local floodplain. 300 men, a substantial and deliberately organised labour force specifically allocated to a road project. This was not corvée labour pressed into reluctant service. This was a coordinated civic effort to address a specific pressing problem. At Rochester in Kent, excavations revealed that the medieval town's main bridge approach had been paved with ragstone, the local grey limestone that could be quarried from nearby hillsides. At Chester, a medieval cobbled street was excavated in near-perfect condition, its rounded river stones set in sand in a pattern that channeled water toward the centre drain, rather than letting it pool and undermine the edges. And in the Sussex town of New Winchelsea, a stretch of medieval paving that has survived under a medieval gate since the late 13th century shows a technique of remarkable sophistication. Tillgate stone, a hard sandstone from the local weald set on edge rather than flat. Tiles standing upright in the ground rather than lying horizontally, which dramatically increased the surface's resistance to being displaced by cartwheels, while simultaneously improving drainage between the standing stones. Someone figured that out. Some unnamed medieval paving craftsman working in the late 1300s worked out that if you stood your paving stones on edge instead of laying them flat, the road lasted longer. That is the kind of knowledge that textbooks rarely record because it was never written down. It just passed from master to apprentice, hand to hand for generations. This brings me to something I want to pause on because it matters. We have a persistent tendency, I think, to assume that medieval people were doing the best they could with inferior understanding, that they were groping towards solutions that we already know, that the history of technology is a straight upward line from ignorance to knowledge, and medieval road builders were simply lower on that line than we are. The stone set on edge in Winchelsea argues against that. The 3-layer timber causeway in Berlin argues against it. The oak planks with notches cut to fit the crossed pegs in the Somerset levels argue against it with particular force, given that those planks were made nearly 6,000 years ago. Medieval builders and stretching back much further prehistoric builders possess genuine, sophisticated, hard-won technical knowledge about materials and construction, knowledge they had earned through generations of trial observation, failure, and improvement. Some of that knowledge, frankly, we have lost. The specific craft understanding of how to read a piece of timber for grain and hardness, of how to assess a stretch of ground for its drainage properties and load-bearing capacity. These are embodied skills that cannot be reconstructed from descriptions alone, and most of their possessors are long dead. The third language was earth itself. Clay, gravel, sand, and various combinations thereof used not as a substitute for the real road materials, but as primary building medium in its own right. The crowned road, a road surface built up into a slight arch higher in the centre than at the edges, is one of the quieter pieces of medieval engineering genius. The principle is simple. If the road surface is even slightly convex in cross-section, water runs off to the sides rather than pooling in the centre. The centre of the road stays drier and firmer. The wheel ruts, if they form at all, form at the edges, rather than directly in the travel line. Medieval road builders used this principle extensively. Surviving earthen causeways from England, France, and the Low Countries show a consistent practice of raising the road surface above the surrounding ground and shaping it to drain. The drainage ditches on either side, those long, often neglected trenches that medieval lords were legally required to maintain, and that medieval labourers complained about having to dig, were not just for removing standing water. They were the destination for the water that the crowned road surface was shedding. The whole system raised surface-sloped cross-section lateral drainage ditches worked as an integrated unit. Break any one element and the others failed. If the drainage ditch filled with debris and the water could not escape the crowned surface, pooled at the edges, and the road collapsed from the sides inward. If the road surface was not maintained in its convex shape, if it had been allowed to become hollowed in the centre by repeated wheel traffic, the crown inverted. and suddenly the centre of the road was the lowest point, collecting water, softening, becoming impassable. This is why road maintenance in the medieval period was not simply a matter of patching holes. It required an understanding of the whole system surface shape drainage flow ditch condition as an interconnected unit, and it required someone with the skill to assess that system and direct repairs to the right place. Often that someone was the reeve, the estate manager, the person who in an age before any formal civil engineering profession existed, accumulated the practical knowledge of how the roads in his area worked, which sections failed first, and why what materials worked best in each location, and how many days of labour a given stretch of road required to keep it functional through a wet autumn. The reeve was never celebrated. He received no monuments. History has not remembered his name. But in a very real sense, the reeve was the road engineer of medieval England, carrying in his head a working map of every failing causeway and silted ditch in his lord's territory and knowing what to do about it. Here is something I keep coming back to when I think about all three of these materials, wood, stone and earth, and the people who worked with them. Every single technique I have described tonight was developed in response to a problem, a specific local practical problem. Ground that was too wet or too steep or too soft or too exposed to frost. The solution was not imported from some central authority or derived from theoretical principles. It was worked out on site in real conditions by people who needed to cross that particular piece of ground safely and had to figure out with whatever was available how to make that possible. The medieval road was not a monument to planning, it was a monument to necessity. And there is something in that, something about the directness of the relationship between problem and solution, between material and use, that I find genuinely beautiful. Every plank in the Berlin Causeway was chosen by someone who knew that specific plank, who had looked at the grain and felt the weight and made a judgment. Every stone set on edge in Winchelsea was placed by a craftsman who understood in their hands and shoulders and the small of their back exactly what resistance the stone offered and how it would bear against the stones next to it. There is one more thing worth saying before we move on, and it is something that archaeology has made very clear in recent decades. We have dramatically underestimated how much medieval builders knew about drainage. The integrated drainage system crowned road lateral ditches, regular culverts under the road to carry the water away, was not a late medieval innovation. Archaeological evidence shows it being practiced consistently from the early medieval period. In the south of England, in France, in the Low Countries, in Germany, wherever the ground was soft and wet enough to make drainage an urgent concern, medieval builders developed sophisticated responses. And here is the part that genuinely impressed me when I first encountered it. They understood that different soils responded differently to drainage, and they adjusted their techniques accordingly. Clay ground needed deep ditches and regular clearing because clay does not drain naturally. The water sits in it. Sandy or gravelly ground needed shallower drainage infrastructure, but required different surface materials because it was more susceptible to erosion. Peat ground, like the Somerset levels, like the boggy margins of the German plain, needed to be raised above the water table entirely, which is why the timber causeway was the standard solution there. They did not have the vocabulary of soil science, but they had the knowledge. And knowledge, it turns out, is often more durable than the roads themselves. So now we have our picture. We have the accidental roads, the holloways, the drovers' tracks, the paths worn into the earth by pure repetition. We have the coerced roads, the corvée labour, the manor obligations, the patched and muddy and barely adequate infrastructure of feudal Europe. And we have the deliberate roads, the timber causeways, the cobbled approaches, the crowned earthen causeways with their drainage ditches, built with genuine engineering intelligence by people who knew their materials and their landscape. But there is one more force that shaped medieval roads, and it may be the most powerful of them all. It was not fear. It was not obligation. It was not even commerce. It was faith. In the 12th and 13th centuries, something extraordinary happened to the roads of Europe. Not in any one country, not according to any single plan, but across the whole continent, from the north of England to the south of Spain, from the coast of Portugal to the hills of northern Italy, a vast and spontaneous wave of movement began. Millions of people got up, left their homes and started walking. Not because they had to, not because someone told them to, but because they believed with a depth and sincerity that is very difficult to recreate imaginatively from our distance, that at the end of a long and difficult road there was something worth suffering for. That is where we are headed next. The roads of faith, the pilgrim paths, and the extraordinary human story of how belief carved some of the most enduring paths in all of European history into the stone and earth of the continent. A man kneels at the top of a mountain pass in the Pyrenees. He's been walking for 3 weeks. His boots are worn through at the heels. His feet have blisters on their blisters. His cloak is damp from 2 days of rain that has just now today finally stopped. Behind him, through the gap in the peaks, he can see the green hills of France receding into the distance, the country he left behind, the language he speaks, the family he kissed goodbye in a village square whose name you and I will never know. Before him, the long rolling descent into northern Spain, hundreds of miles still to walk, mountains, river crossings, plains, the possibility of bandits on the road ahead, the near certainty of illness somewhere along the way, and at the very end of it, if he survives, which many pilgrims did not, a cathedral in a rain-washed city at the edge of the continent, containing what he believes with absolute sincerity to be the bones of one of the 12 apostles. He looks back over France one more time. He wonders if he will ever see it again. Then he turns and starts walking south. Welcome to the 12th century. Welcome to the age of pilgrimage, one of the most extraordinary, most misunderstood and most consequential social phenomena in all of medieval history. Because here is what most people do not realize about the great pilgrim roads of medieval Europe. They were not just religious. They were engineering projects, economic engines, political instruments, infrastructure schemes that no king could have deliberately designed and no treasury could have fully funded. They were built, maintained, expanded and improved over a period of 3 centuries almost entirely by the force of human belief, and they changed the roads of Europe more profoundly than any emperor, any army or any corvée ever had. Let me give you the numbers first, because they genuinely stop me in my tracks every time I encounter them. At the height of the Camino de Santiago, the great pilgrimage route to the tomb of St. James in northwestern Spain, in the 12th and 13th centuries, an estimated 250,000 pilgrims made the journey every single year. Some historians place the peak numbers even higher. By the 13th century, certain accounts suggest that at any given moment as much as 10% of Europe's entire population was either on a pilgrimage returning from one, or actively preparing for the next one. Think about what that means in practical terms. 250,000 people walking the same network of roads every year for decades, needing to eat, sleep, cross rivers, navigate mountain passes, find shelter from rain, get medical care when they fell ill, which was often, carrying only what they could carry on their backs, covering 10 to 15 miles a day, stopping at every town and village and monastery along the way. That is not a spiritual experience. That is simultaneously an economic revolution and a road-building program. The pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela had its origin in a discovery, or what was claimed to be a discovery. In the early 9th century, in the remote northwestern corner of the Iberian Peninsula, a shepherd named Pelayo reported seeing strange lights flickering in the forest. He followed them, and in the clearing where the lights had led him he found an ancient tomb. the local bishop was summoned. The local bishop declared that the tomb contained the remains of St. James the Apostle, who had according to tradition travelled to Spain to preach before returning to Jerusalem and his execution. King Alfonso II of Asturias was notified. Alfonso made the journey from his capital at Oviedo to visit the site himself, a journey that would become much later the Camino Primitivo, the oldest of all the Camino routes. The king ordered a chapel built. Over the next century and a half, the chapel grew into a church, the church grew into a cathedral, the village around it grew into a city, and the city became Santiago de Compostela, one of the three great pilgrimage destinations of medieval Christendom, alongside Jerusalem and Rome. Now, I want to be honest about something here because I think intellectual honesty is more interesting than hagiography. Historians are divided about the specific discovery. The question of whether those particular remains actually belong to St. James or to anyone connected to the early Christian church is genuinely open. What is not open is the human reality of what happened next. Millions of people believed it deeply and completely, and they acted on that belief. And they're acting on that belief. They're walking, they're suffering. Their crossing of mountains and rivers and plains is one of the most consequential human acts in the history of European infrastructure. The belief was the engine. The roads were what the engine made. By the 12th century, what had begun as a trickle of devout Spanish and French pilgrims had become something that barely has a modern equivalent. There were pilgrims from England crossing the Channel and walking south through France to the Pyrenees. Pilgrims from Germany walking west, pilgrims from Scandinavia and Flanders and Italy, and the Byzantine Empire converging on a handful of major routes that funneled them toward the mountains of northern Spain. The 12th century guidebook to the Camino de Liber Sancti Jacobi, compiled by a monk named Emeric Picor, describes with remarkable frankness the conditions these pilgrims faced. Thick forests, marshes full of mosquitoes, wild animals, rivers too deep or too fast to ford safely, water sources that were poisoned or brackish, disease everywhere. The guide specifically warns pilgrims about certain rivers in northern Spain whose water was undrinkable, noting that locals who knew better used the same water only to wash their horses' feet, while unwitting pilgrims drank it and became ill. It warns about professional thieves in the region south of Santes in France, who disguised themselves as pilgrims or priests in order to gain the confidence of genuine travellers before robbing them. After the 11th century, historians note virtually no pilgrim travelled the Camino alone. Safety in numbers was not a spiritual choice, it was a survival strategy. And now here is the part that matters most for our story. That flood of pilgrims, those hundreds of thousands of people converging on a handful of roads, year after year, did something that generations of feudal lords with their corvée labour had never quite managed to do. It made roads economically important enough to fix. When 100,000 pilgrims a year are walking a particular route, every town on that route has a powerful financial incentive to keep that route accessible. A bridge that washes out in spring flood means hundreds of travellers rerouted away from your town, spending their money somewhere else. An impassable stretch of road means your inn sits empty through the pilgrimage season. A reliable river ford means prosperity. An unreliable one means stagnation. So bridges got built. Not just thrown together timber crossings that would last a decade and then collapse, but serious stone bridges permanent engineered built to carry the weight of sustained heavy traffic. The Puente la Reina in Navarre, whose name simply means the Bridge of the Queen, was built in the 11th century specifically to give Camino pilgrims a safe crossing of the river Arga. It is still standing. You can walk across it today. The 6 arches it rests on have carried pilgrims for nearly 1,000 years and show no signs of stopping. Hospitals were founded. Not hospitals in the modern sense, more like hostels for the sick and the exhausted, but buildings specifically purposed for caring for travellers who had fallen ill on the road. The Spanish town of Hospital de Orbigo takes its name directly from the pilgrim hospital that was established there and is still called that today. The roads themselves were improved by kings, nobles, monasteries and guilds, all of whom had come to understand that a steady flow of pilgrims was worth investing in. King Sancho the Great and King Alfonso VI of Castile and Leon developed and improved the Camino Francés the French way, the main route through northern Spain deliberately and systematically through their territories, partly from genuine piety, partly from strategic awareness that the pilgrim road was the most efficient mechanism available for connecting their kingdoms to the rest of Christian Europe. Romanesque architecture spread along the pilgrim routes because pilgrims who had seen the great abbey churches of Burgundy carried descriptions home, and local builders tried to replicate what they had been told about. The architectural style of an entire civilization moved the way water moves along the lowest, easiest path, which in the 12th century was the Camino. I want to tell you about Sigeric the Serious. And yes, that was actually what they called him, the Serious, which tells you something about his reputation was the Archbishop of Canterbury. In the year 990, he travelled from Canterbury to Rome and back, a journey of approximately 1,900 kilometres each way, to receive his pallium from Pope John XV. The pallium was a special woolen vestment, a kind of ecclesiastical scarf that the Pope gave to newly appointed archbishops as a symbol of their authority. If you were the Archbishop of Canterbury, you could not properly exercise your office without it. So Sigeric walked to Rome, or rode. Historians debate this, but either way he made the journey. And then he did something that neither he nor anyone else at the time could have known would matter for 1,000 years. He wrote it down. Sigeric recorded 79 stopping places on his return journey from Rome to Canterbury. Just the names of the places, a brief note about each stage. The kind of record a careful traveller makes not for posterity, but for his own purposes, to remember the route, perhaps to share with other English clergy who might make the same journey. That document survived. It ended up in the British Library, where it sat in relative obscurity until historians in the 20th century began to understand what they had. Sigeric's diary was the oldest known written itinerary of what became the Via Francigena, the road that came from the land of the Franks, the road connecting Canterbury to Rome across England, France, Switzerland and Italy. The name itself, Via Francigena, the road that comes from Frankish lands, was what the Italians called any road arriving from northern Europe. It appears in a document from the 9th century, meaning the route was already well established long before Sigeric put pen to vellum. He did not discover it. He did not create it. He simply described it at a particular moment in enough detail that we can still use his description as a navigational guide today. Modern pilgrims who walk the Via Francigena in Italy are in a very specific and documented sense, following the same stopping points that Sigeric noted in the year 990. 1,030 years later, on roads that have in some cases not fundamentally changed their line or their character since the 10th century. Now I want to ask you something, and I mean it genuinely. Have you ever done something very difficult, physically, emotionally, logistically difficult? Not because you had to, but because you believed it mattered. A long-distance run. A difficult journey to visit someone you loved. A project you poured yourself into even when no one was asking you to. Something that was genuinely hard and that you did anyway because the doing of it was itself the point. That is, as best I can reconstruct it across 10 centuries of distance, something close to the inner experience of a medieval pilgrim. They did not walk 500 miles because it was convenient. They walked 500 miles at personal risk, at significant expense, often leaving family and farm and livelihood behind for months, because they believed with a certainty that we may find difficult to imagine but should be careful not to dismiss, that the walking itself was the spiritual act, that the suffering was the prayer, that the road was the transformation. Medieval pilgrims who reached Santiago were expected to collect a scallop shell from the coast beyond the city as proof of their journey. Those who returned from Rome wore the crossed keys of St. Peter. Those who had made it to Jerusalem carried palm fronds. These were not trophies. They were credentials, evidence of completed suffering of faith enacted rather than merely professed. Before leaving home, a medieval pilgrim was expected to make a will, to pay all debts, to apologize to everyone they had wronged, to confess to their priest, because pilgrimage was genuinely dangerous. Many pilgrims did not come back. The road killed them through disease, through accident, through the casual violence that waited in the forests and along the mountain passes, and they went anyway. That willingness, that extraordinary, irrational, deeply human willingness to walk into danger for the sake of something believed rather than known, is what built the pilgrim roads of Europe. Not money, not law, not obligation, belief. Here is what that belief accomplished in physical terms. The Via Francigena connected Canterbury to Rome through more than a dozen modern countries, crossing the Alps at the Great St. Bernard Pass and descending through Tuscany toward the Eternal City. Along its length, monasteries and pilgrim hostels were built at intervals of roughly a day's walk, approximately 15 to 20 miles apart, specifically to accommodate travellers. These hostels became over time nodes of economic activity. Markets grew up around them. Craftsmen settled nearby to sell to pilgrims. Towns developed. Several Italian cities that are today among the most visited in the world, Siena, Lucca, Fidenza, developed their medieval character, in part because they lay on the Via Francigena and the pilgrim traffic that passed through them, century after century, generated the wealth and the cultural exchange that produced their remarkable art and architecture. The Camino de Santiago did the same thing for northern Spain. Towns along the French Way exist today in their current form, in their current size, in their current cultural character, partly because 100,000 pilgrims a year walk through them for 3 centuries. The economic logic of pilgrimage infrastructure shaped the urban geography of an entire region, and the roads that connected these places, the actual physical roads, maintained and improved by the towns and monasteries and kingdoms along the way, because the pilgrim traffic made maintenance worth the cost. Those roads were a network, a genuine network connecting the isolated, fragmented, barely connected settlements of medieval Europe into something resembling a circulatory system. I want to leave you with one small specific image from that world. The ferryman of the River Po in northern Italy on the Via Francigena route has been operating a river crossing at the same location on the same river since 1998, when a man named Danilo Parisi established the service specifically for Via Francigena pilgrims. Since that first crossing, he has kept a meticulous record of every pilgrim who has used his ferry, every name, every country of origin, every date. But what strikes me is not the modern record. What strikes me is this, that there has almost certainly been a ferry crossing at or near that same point on the River Po since at least the 10th century, when Sigaric noted that particular stretch of his journey. Medieval pilgrims who could not wade or find a bridge needed ferrymen. Ferrymen needed traffic. Traffic came from the pilgrims, and the need to cross the same river at roughly the same point over and over and over, year after year, century after century. That need is what eventually produced a reliable crossing. A crossing that became in time a feature of the road, a fact of the landscape. The pilgrim did not think, I will build infrastructure. The pilgrim thought, I need to get across this river. But the crossing came to exist because enough people thought that thought, and the river kept flowing, and generation after generation stood on the same bank, looking at the same water, all needing the same thing. The road was built one crossing at a time, something that has been nagging at me through this whole story, and I suspect might be nagging at you too. We have talked about the ordinary roads, the corvée-built mud and gravel, barely passable tracks between villages. We've talked about the accidental roads, the holloways, the drovers' tracks, the paths worn by repetition and need. We have talked about the pilgrim roads built by faith and maintained by commerce. But in all of this, we've mostly been talking about roads that serve the living. There is one more force we've not yet mentioned, the force that in some ways understood medieval roads better than anyone else. Not the lords, not the pilgrims, not the merchants. The merchants who knew that the most valuable commodity in the medieval economy was something that most people today take entirely for granted: salt. And the extraordinary network of roads that salt built across Europe, roads that still exist, roads that still bear the name of the thing they carried, roads so old and so strategically important that kings fought wars over the right to control them. Stay with me. Salt. I want to start with that word for just a moment because I think we've lost our ability to feel its weight. You have a shaker of it on your kitchen counter. It costs you almost nothing. You reach for it without thinking. You probably use too much of it, honestly most of us do. And if you ran out, you would simply go to the store. Now try to imagine that you cannot do that. Imagine that you live in a village in Central Europe somewhere in the year 1100. You have a family to feed. It is early autumn. You have slaughtered a pig, the pig that has been eating scraps all summer, and that you have been saving for this moment, and now you are faced with one unavoidable reality. If you do not salt that pork today, it will be inedible within a week. It will rot, and your family will go hungry sometime in January or February, when the snow is thick and the roads are impassable and there is nothing growing in the frozen fields. Salt is not a seasoning in your world. Salt is the difference between eating in February and not eating in February. And if the road between your village and the nearest salt supply is broken or flooded or blocked or controlled by a lord demanding payment you cannot afford, then the salt does not come, and the pork rots. And you remember this lesson the following autumn, and the autumn after that. That is why roads were built for salt. The word salary comes from salt, in Latin salarium, payment in salt. Roman soldiers received a salt allowance as part of their compensation because salt was that valuable, that practical, that universally necessary. Every culture that ever preserved meat or fish or vegetables for winter storage understood that salt was not a luxury commodity. It was a survival mechanism. And in medieval Europe, where refrigeration was not even a concept, where the entire agricultural calendar was built around the rhythm of growing, harvesting, slaughtering and preserving the salt supply, was not something you could afford to disrupt. This created roads, not roads built by command, not roads built by corvée, not roads built by pilgrims walking in faith. Roads built by pure, unadorned economic necessity. The same necessity that drives water downhill and routes toward light. The necessity of we need this thing, the thing is over there, and between here and there is a problem we need to solve. In the Austrian Alps there is a small lakeside town called Hallstatt. If you have not heard of it, it is worth knowing, not for any dramatic historical event, but for the extraordinary accident of preservation that has made it one of the most archaeologically important places in Europe. The salt mines above Hallstatt have been worked continuously in one form or another since roughly the 5th millennium before the Common Era. That is 7,000 years of salt mining from a single mountain valley. The name of the town itself contains the German word for salt, Salz, and the same word gives us the nearby city of Salzburg, literally Salt Castle, and the river Salzach, literally Salt River. The entire geography of that region is named for the thing that made it matter. What the waterlogged conditions inside the mine have preserved over those millennia is extraordinary. In the year 1734, a miner working deep in an active salt tunnel came upon a human body. Not a skeleton, a body. Preserved by the salt in the rock around it, the soft tissue still intact after 3,000 years. The miner was wearing Bronze Age clothing. He was carrying Bronze Age tools, In the 1900s, archaeologists excavating the same mine found a wooden staircase dated by tree ring analysis to 1344 before the Common Era. It is the oldest wooden staircase in Europe. They found leather shoes, woolen sacks, food scraps, the everyday debris of industrial labour performed by people whose names no document has ever recorded, preserved in perfect condition by the same substance they were working to extract. And among the finds along the trade routes leading out from Hallstatt across the Alps, along the rivers toward the Danube south toward the Mediterranean, archaeologists have found ceramics from southern Italy and Greece, ivory sword handles from the Mediterranean, amber from the Baltic coast. People were exchanging goods across extraordinary distances, and the centrifugal force drawing them into that exchange was salt from an Austrian mountain. The roads that connected Hallstatt to those distant markets were among the oldest trade routes in the Alps. They were not roads in any formal sense, paths really following ridgelines and river valleys, avoiding the steepest terrain because salt was heavy, and the carriers needed the easiest possible grade. But they were deliberately chosen, deliberately used, deliberately maintained in the sense that people kept walking them year after year because the trade demanded it. Those paths were already old when the medieval period began. The medieval salt trade did not create them, it inherited them. Let me tell you about a road in Scotland that I find particularly remarkable. There is a road, or what was once a road now, largely buried under tarmac, that runs from the coastal town of Prestonpans on the southern shore of the Firth of Forth, near Edinburgh southward through the Scottish countryside toward an old hospital at Sutra. The road has an unofficial name, the Salters Road. Prestonpans received its name from salt. In 1198, the monks of Newbattle Abbey were granted lands on the coast, and they began panning for salt from the seawater, digging shallow pans in the shore, filling them with seawater, using coal that they were simultaneously mining from the same stretch of coastline to boil the brine until only the salt crystals remained. The settlement that grew up around their operation was called straightforwardly Prieststown, and then, because the salt pans were the defining feature, Prestonpans. The salt those monks produced had to go somewhere. Salt was a significant economic resource in medieval Scotland. The interior needed it. Monasteries, royal households, market towns, individual farms all required steady supplies. So the monks built or maintained or improved a road southward. The Salters Road, named for what it carried. It had an offshoot toward Dalkeith specifically to supply the monks at Newbattle Abbey with their own product, which is a detail I find quietly amusing, the monks producing salt at the coast and then transporting some of it back to their own inland abbey. But supply chains have never been simple. And there was another road in Scotland now completely lost to history with a name so specific and so wonderful that I cannot pass it by. It was called the King's Cadger's Road. A cadger in medieval Scotland was a travelling pedlar, someone who carried goods from place to place on a horse or a cart, selling to whoever needed what he was carrying. The King's Cadger was a particular and apparently favoured individual whose specific job was to bring fresh fish from the coastal settlement of Usan, near Montrose in the northeast, to whatever royal residence the king happened to be visiting in the interior. Fresh fish, not salted fish, not preserved fish. Fresh fish carried as fast as a horse could manage along a road that existed for no other purpose than to get that specific product to that specific consumer before it spoiled. A road built for a king's appetite for fresh fish. I find medieval history most alive in details like that. Now pull back and look at the larger picture. The trade routes that crisscrossed medieval Europe were not random. They were not the product of chance or whim. They followed certain consistent principles that any merchant or carter who used them would have understood implicitly even if they never articulated them. First, go where the ground is firm. Heavily loaded carts and salt carts were very heavily loaded, often carrying as much as 800 to 1,000 pounds of cargo, could not travel across soft or waterlogged ground. They needed road surfaces that could support that weight without sinking. This is why medieval trade routes consistently followed ridgelines above valley floors, hugged the edges of river terraces, and avoided low-lying ground whenever possible. Second go where the water is manageable. Rivers were simultaneously the arteries of medieval commerce and its greatest obstacle. A river with a reliable ford or a maintained bridge was an asset on a trade route. A river without either was a barrier that forced routes miles out of their way to find a crossing. The medieval map of trade routes is largely a map of river crossings, places where the water was shallow enough to ford safely, or deep enough and calm enough to navigate by boat, or narrow enough to bridge at reasonable cost. Third go where someone will feed your horses and shelter your goods. The medieval merchant did not travel alone. He travelled with a cart or several carts pulled by animals that needed to eat substantial quantities of feed every day, and that could cover roughly 15 to 20 miles in a day's haul. This meant overnight stops were not optional. They were the fundamental structure of overland trade. Wherever those stops occurred, towns developed, markets grew, services multiplied. The salt route from Lüneburg to Lübeck in northern Germany, 100 kilometers of medieval road through the flat waterlogged landscape of what is now Lower Saxony and Schleswig-Holstein, was perhaps the single most economically significant inland road in northern Europe during the medieval period. Lüneburg was a salt-producing city whose prosperity rested entirely on the vast underground brine deposits beneath it. Documents from the year 956 record King Otto I of Germany, granting the customs revenue from the Lüneburg saltworks to the local monastery, which tells you that by the 10th century, the salt trade through this town was already generating enough revenue that it was worth explicitly regulating. The route northward from Lüneburg to the port of Lübeck carried the salt that preserved the herring that fed a significant portion of northern Europe through the winter months. Lübeck without Lüneburg salt could not have preserved its fish. Without preserved fish, the Baltic trade network that became the Hanseatic League could not have sustained itself. And without the road connecting salt source to port, none of it worked. The alliance between Lübeck and Hamburg, formalized in 1241 that became the seed of the Hanseatic League, was in no small part an agreement to protect that road, to keep it passable, to prevent the local lords who controlled the territory through which it ran from levying tolls so punishing that the trade became uneconomical. The Hanseatic League, which at its height included over 200 cities stretching from London to Novgorod, exercising political and economic power that kings negotiated with, carefully began in a very real sense as a road maintenance agreement. I want to pause on that for a moment because I think it is genuinely striking. One of the most powerful political and economic entities in medieval European history, an organization with no army, no crown, no territory, no permanent government, that nonetheless forced kings and queens to treat it as a co-equal power, began because someone needed to keep a road safe enough to move salt on. Not ideology, not religion, not dynastic ambition. Salt. There is a lesson in that about how civilization actually works, as opposed to how we tend to tell the story of civilization in textbooks and documentaries. The grand political structures, the leagues, the alliances, the treaties, are usually sitting on top of something much more mundane. Someone needs to get a specific thing from a specific place to another specific place, and the obstacles between those two places are forcing them to cooperate with people they might otherwise have nothing to do with. The road is not the symbol of civilization. The road is the mechanism by which the practical requirements of daily life generate the social structures we later recognize as civilization. Can I ask you something that has nothing to do with medieval history? Think about the last time something that felt very small, a single conversation, a single decision, one phone call you almost did not make led to something much larger than you expected. Something that changed the shape of your life in a way you could not have predicted when you made that small practical choice. That is what the medieval salt road was. A practical choice made again and again and again by merchants who needed to move a heavy essential commodity across a difficult landscape. Not heroic, not romantic, just we need to solve this problem. What is the easiest way from here to there? And the accumulated answer to that practical question, repeated by enough people over enough centuries, built cities, built trade networks, built political structures that outlasted the kings and the kingdoms that surrounded them. Salt was the most important, but it was not the only commodity that built medieval roads in this way. Wool built roads across England, particularly across the limestone uplands of the Cotswolds and the chalk downs of the south, where sheep farming was the primary economic activity, and the wool trade with the continent, particularly with the great cloth-making cities of Flanders, was the financial backbone of the medieval English economy. Packhorse routes roads too narrow for carts, but maintained specifically for the strings of packhorses that carried wool from farms to collection points, and then onward to ports spread across the landscape like capillaries, feeding the larger veins of the major trade routes. Tin-built roads in Cornwall in the extreme southwestern corner of England, where the mines had been producing since the Bronze Age, and the metal was still being exported to continental Europe in the medieval period. The Cornish tin roads were among the oldest maintained routes in Britain. Iron-built roads in the Weald of Sussex and Kent in southeastern England, where the combination of iron ore and dense woodland provided both the raw material and the fuel for smelting. The ironmasters' roads wide enough for heavy carts carrying raw ore or finished metal cut through the clay and the forest in patterns that are still visible in the landscape today, long after the industry they served has vanished. Each of these commodities generated its own specific road infrastructure shaped by the particular requirements of the material being transported. A pack-horse route carrying wool needed to be firm enough to keep horses' hooves from sinking in mud, but did not need to be wide enough for a cart. A road carrying iron ingots needed to be substantially wider and capable of supporting much greater loads. A road carrying salt from a coastal production site needed reliable drainage because salt is hygroscopic. It absorbs moisture from the air, and salt that got wet in transit was salt that was dissolving and losing value with every rain shower. The road was not a generic infrastructure. It was a specific response to a specific commodity's specific requirements. There is one last aspect of the medieval trade road that I think deserves its own moment, because it is something we tend to overlook entirely. The medieval merchant did not follow the same road year-round. This sounds obvious once you hear it, but think about it carefully. A road that was perfectly usable in August might be completely impassable in March. The same road that carried a heavy salt cart safely in a dry summer might swallow that cart up to its axles in an autumn that had seen more rain than usual. The medieval merchant had to carry in the head not just the knowledge of what roads existed, but what those roads were like at different times of year in different weather conditions, after different patterns of rainfall. Summer roads, winter roads, spring roads. In winter, paradoxically, some routes became more viable rather than less. When the ground froze hard, rivers and marshes that were impassable in autumn became firm enough to cross. The same marsh that stopped a cart in October might support it in January. Some winter routes ran directly across frozen rivers or frozen fenland, following lines that would have been absurdly dangerous in any other season. The merchant who understood these seasonal rhythms had a genuine competitive advantage over one who did not. Getting salt to market before the spring mud season made it impossible staying off certain routes during the frost heave of early spring when the ground was alternately frozen and thawed and notoriously unstable. These were professional skills. Practical knowledge lived in the body accumulated over years of travel. The road was not a fact, it was a relationship between a traveller and a landscape shaped by season and weather, and the specific weight of the cargo being carried, salt wool, tin iron, fish, and the roads that each commodity built, maintained, wore down and rebuilt. But here is where I want to leave you tonight as the hour gets late, and the sounds outside your window grow quieter. All of those roads built by serfs under obligation, worn by pilgrims under faith, carved by salt merchants under necessity, they did not exist in isolation. They were a network, and a network is something fundamentally different from a collection of individual roads. A network has a logic that no single road possesses. It creates connections that its builders never intended. A salt road between two cities becomes incidentally a road that a messenger can use to carry news, a route that a traveller can use to reach a relative, a path that an army can use to move quickly through territory it would otherwise have had to navigate blind. Roads generate roads, connections generate connections. The medieval landscape was not a static thing with paths cut through it. It was a living, growing, constantly evolving web of human movement, and at every crossing, every bridge, every ford, every overnight stop, something new was possible that had not been possible before. Which is why when a road is blocked, when a bridge falls, when a ford becomes impassable, the effect ripples outward in ways that are almost impossible to predict. And no one in medieval Europe understood this more clearly or exploited it more ruthlessly than the people who had learned to use roads as weapons. Not merchants, not pilgrims, not monks. The lords who built castles at the choke points. The kings who kept bridges in disrepair when they served their interests. The military commanders who understood that controlling a road meant controlling everything that moved along it, and that blocking a road could be as devastating as any army. That story, the story of roads, as weapons, as instruments of power, as strategic tools that shape the political geography of medieval Europe, is one of the most fascinating chapters in this whole journey. Something has been itching at the back of this story for a while now, and I think it is time we faced it directly. Every road we have discussed so far has been built with movement in mind, getting people and goods and animals from one place to another. The corvée built roads because lords needed their supplies to arrive. The pilgrims built roads because faith pulled them forward. The salt merchants built roads because winter was coming and the meat needed preserving. But movement cuts both ways. A road that lets your grain merchant come to market also lets an invading army march to your castle. A bridge that your pilgrims need to cross the river is the same bridge your enemy's cavalry will use when they decide to visit you with hostile intentions. A clear maintained path through a forest is invaluable for trade and absolutely catastrophic if you are the one being pursued through it. The medieval mind understood this with a clarity that we in our age of freeways and satellite navigation have almost entirely lost. Roads were not neutral infrastructure. Roads were power. Roads were danger. Roads were in the right circumstances weapons wielded as deliberately as any sword. William, Duke of Normandy, stepped ashore on the English coast in September of 1066 carrying not just an army but a plan, and his plan was at its core a road plan. He landed at Pevensey. One of the first things he did before he'd even properly consolidated his beachhead was build a castle. Then he moved to Hastings and built another. Then he defeated the last Saxon king of England at the Battle of Hastings on the 14th of October 1066, and immediately began the most sophisticated piece of territorial control through road management that medieval England had ever seen. He cut off the roads to London, not by burning them, not by blocking them physically. He performed what historians describe as a gigantic loop around southeastern England, taking Dover, then Winchester, then Canterbury, moving in a deliberate arc that placed his army between London and any possible relief from the north or west. He was not simply marching to the capital. He was systematically severing every approach road to London one by one until the city had no military options left. The surviving English nobles surrendered without a final battle because William had rendered all roads into London either controlled by him or strategically irrelevant. He was crowned King of England on Christmas Day 1066, Westminster Abbey, and within weeks his response to the inevitable rebellions that followed was to build castles, not randomly placed castles on roads. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle records with a kind of weary precision that the king rode to Nottingham and built a castle there, and also at York 2 castles, and in Lincoln and everywhere in that district. Lincoln, Nottingham, York, 3 cities all positioned on the Great North Road that connected London to the northern reaches of England. 3 castles on 3 of the most strategically vital road intersections in the country. Here is the detail that I find extraordinary. Lincoln Castle was built directly on top of the site of a Roman fortress. That Roman fortress had been placed precisely there by engineers who understood the landscape 1,000 years before William arrived, because it commanded the road junction, where Ermine Street, the great Roman North Road from London to York, crossed the road west toward the legionary fortress at Chester. The Normans did not choose that site because they were clever. They chose it because the Romans had already identified it as the most strategically important road crossing in the East Midlands, and because a road junction that mattered in 59 of the Common Era, when Roman legions used it, still mattered in 1066 when Norman cavalry did. The ground had not changed. The river had not changed. The roads had not changed. Only the soldiers and the fortifications above them had. This is the thing about roads and military power that I keep turning over in my mind. The strategic value of a road junction does not expire. If you control the place where 2 major roads cross, you can tax everything that moves through your territory. You can intercept messages. You can stop any army that does not have enough force to dislodge you. You can shelter, resupply, and reinforce your own troops before they continue in any direction you choose. William understood this instinctively. His castle-building program was not, and historians are quite clear on this, a response to specific military threats in specific locations. It was a systematic occupation of the road network. Between 500 and 600 Norman castles were built in England in the decades following the conquest. That is not a defence against particular rebels. That is a grid. An overlapping, mutually reinforcing grid of control points, positioned along the roads and at the river crossings that made the entire country function. And here is where it becomes genuinely stark in a way that deserves to be said plainly. In Lincoln, building the castle required demolishing 166 houses. In Norwich, 113 houses. In Cambridge, 27. These were not empty lots or abandoned ruins. These were occupied homes belonging to families who had lived there for generations. Those families were displaced by legal compulsion, which is to say by the threat of force, so that a castle could be built in the strategically optimal position. The road was not just being controlled. The people who lived on it, who depended on it, who had built their lives around it, they were being repositioned like pieces on a board to suit the requirements of the control infrastructure. Here is a question for you that might sound simple but is actually quite deep. What is the difference between a legitimate toll and a robbery? The medieval answer to that question turned out to be whoever has the authority to enforce the distinction. When the Holy Roman Empire was functioning with a strong emperor at its centre, there was an accepted system of toll collection along the Rhine, the most important commercial river in northern Europe. Authorized lords and archbishops collected tolls from passing merchant ships at rates that were regulated, recognized, and broadly accepted as the cost of doing business on a particular stretch of water. Then, in the year 1250, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II died, and the empire entered what historians call the Great Interregnum, a period of 23 years, during which no emperor held effective authority. Within 4 years, the number of toll collection points on the Rhine had at least doubled. These were not authorized tolls. They were, in the language of medieval chroniclers, the lonia injusta, unjust tolls, imposed by minor lords, impoverished knights, and local strongmen who had built or seized castles along the river banks and the road approaches, and who used their fortified positions to demand payment from any merchant passing within reach. Not payment to the emperor, not payment under any recognized legal framework. Payment to them personally, in exchange for the right to continue moving. The Germans coined a word for these men, Robritter, robber knights. The German for robber baron, a term so vivid and so accurate that it survived into the 19th and 20th centuries to describe an entirely different category of economic predator. But the original Raubritter were very specific people doing a very specific thing, using control of roads and rivers as a mechanism for personal enrichment, at the expense of the commercial traffic that was the lifeblood of medieval northern Europe. The Rhine League formed in 1254 a coalition of cities including Mainz, Cologne and Speyer, banding together in exactly the same spirit that had produced the Hanseatic League further north, responded with what might charitably be called direct action. They besieged at least 10 robber castles between 1254 and 1257, tearing down the fortifications that had been used to control the roads and driving the Raubritter off the riverbanks. The procedure they pioneered, besiege, capture and demolish the castle, became the standard response to road predation for generations afterward. When the interregnum finally ended and the new Emperor Rudolf of Habsburg took power, he applied the same method at a place called Suneck. The castle of a particularly notorious toll extortioner was stormed, the structure was burned to the ground, and its owner was hanged. The message was unambiguous. The road belongs to commerce. Control the road for your own enrichment, and you will answer for it. But the Raubritter represent only the most obvious, most visible version of the relationship between roads and power. There was a subtler version that operated all through the medieval period, more pervasive, more systematic, and in some ways more interesting to think about: the deliberate maintenance of bad roads. This is a concept that most of us find genuinely difficult to grasp because we live in a world where good roads are unambiguously good for everyone. We assume that any medieval lord would naturally want the roads through his territory to be as passable as possible, for the simple reason that passable roads facilitated trade and trade generated revenue. But the reality was considerably more complicated. A perfectly maintained road through your territory made it easy for armies to move through it. Your own army, yes, but your enemy's armies too. A king with a solid road network could project military force into your domain faster than you could respond. And during those long periods of medieval history, when the relationship between central royal authority and local lordly power was actively contested, which is to say, for most of the medieval period in most of Europe, a noble had very good reasons to keep certain roads just difficult enough that royal armies could not use them efficiently. The historical record from medieval France and England is full of complaints. Lords who failed to maintain their road sections, bridges left to rot, drainage ditches left uncleaned until they flooded the road surface, brushwood not cut back from the roadside, which was a legal obligation in England after the Statute of Winchester, and one that was frequently ignored. Not all of this was passive negligence. Some of it was active calculation. The English legal text from the late 13th century, the Coutume de Beauvaisis, a comprehensive guide to French customary law, complains with some exasperation about people who stole the stone paving or the timber planks from roads, rendering them narrower than legally required. Some of that theft was poverty, certainly, but some of it served the interests of people who preferred certain roads to be impassable. And during the winter of 1395 to 1396, the route between the Flemish cities of Manille and Lille became, according to contemporary accounts, a slushy mud bath so complete that it was entirely impassable for weeks. This was not a natural disaster. It was the result of years of maintenance neglect on a stretch of road that someone somewhere had calculated was more useful to them broken than whole. The truly brilliant military use of roads in medieval warfare, though, was not in controlling them or destroying them. It was in knowing them better than your opponent, Charlemagne, the great Frankish king who in the late 800s consolidated an empire stretching from what is now France and Germany, deep into Italy, and the borderlands of the Byzantine world, built his military power on a logistical insight that most of his contemporaries had not yet grasped. He understood that the speed of an army is determined not by how fast its fastest soldiers can move, but by how slow its slowest supply wagon is. And the supply wagon moves at the speed of the road it travels on. Charlemagne's cousin, Adelhard of Corbie, recorded in a remarkable document called On the Organization of the Palace that the Carolingian military planning staff met every winter to prepare for the following campaign season. They compiled estate reports from across the empire, reports on what supplies were available, where what roads were passable, in which seasons, where the river crossings were reliable and where they were treacherous. They used this information to pre-position supplies along the intended march routes, so that when the army moved it did not need to forage or plunder to eat. It moved on a planned supply line. This allowed Charlemagne to campaign up to 1,000 miles from his home territory for extended periods, something that no other European power of the period could manage. And it worked because someone every winter had done the painstaking work of understanding the road network in enough detail to plan around it. The road as military intelligence, the road as the basis of logistics, the road as the reason one army could be where another army could not. I want to come back briefly to William and Lincoln Castle because there is a detail in that story I find captures something essential about the medieval understanding of roads. When William built Lincoln Castle, he destroyed 166 houses. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records this as a matter of course a stark number in a document that is generally not given to emotion, but someone counted those houses. Someone assessed the castle site, walked the ground, and calculated that the strategic value of that position on that road junction was worth the displacement of that many families. That calculation was not made by an administrator sitting in an office. It was made by someone who had walked those roads, who knew the land personally, who understood exactly what moving through this particular stretch of England meant in military terms. Road knowledge was a form of power in the medieval world that was every bit as valuable as military strength or legal authority. The commander who knew which road the enemy would have to use, the king who understood which bridge, if controlled, would make the entire campaign impossible for his opponent. The local lord who had spent 30 years learning every ford and every seasonal path through his territory, and who knew exactly which routes to deny to an invader and which to preserve for his own use. These were not cartographers. Maps as we understand them barely existed in medieval Europe before the 14th century. This knowledge lived in human memory, passed from father to son, from commander to lieutenant, inscribed in the bodies and the experience of people who had travelled those roads in all weathers and all seasons and all states of personal emergency. When a castle was built at a road junction, it captured not just the physical ground. It captured the knowledge of that ground, the institutional memory of everyone who had ever used that crossing, funneled now through the castle garrison and available only to those they permitted to pass. So where does this leave us? We have now seen roads as survival, the path the salt merchant must walk. Roads as devotion, the way the pilgrim chooses to suffer. Roads as accident, the hollow worn by 1,000 unremarkable journeys. Roads as craft, the timber causeway, the cobbled approach, the crowned earthen bank. And now roads as power, the strategic asset that kingdoms fought over, that empires were organized around, that determined not just where you could go, but whether you were allowed to go at all. There is one voice in this whole story we've not yet properly heard. The person on the road who had no army to protect them, no castle to retreat to, no lord who gave their safety the slightest consideration. The ordinary traveller, the woman carrying goods to market, the pilgrim who had already been robbed once and was trying again anyway, the merchant calculating whether the risk of the road was worth the opportunity at the other end. Their story, the story of what it was actually like to move through the medieval landscape as an ordinary person who simply needed to get somewhere, is one of the most remarkable and most human chapters in this whole journey. And it happens to contain one of the most extraordinary pieces of medieval travel writing that I have ever encountered. Wait until you hear this one. Somewhere around the year 1413, a woman in her early 40s left the English town of King's Lynn, walked to the port, boarded a ship and set off across the channel. She had 14 children at home. Her husband was alive and, as far as anyone knew, perfectly capable of accompanying her. But she went alone, or rather she went as part of a small group of fellow travellers, none of whom she had known for very long, and most of whom by her own account found her rather difficult company. Her name was Marjorie Kempe, and before she was done she would walk to Jerusalem, to Rome, to Assisi, to Santiago de Compostela, to Norway, to Germany, and to the city of Gdansk on the Baltic coast, a combined distance of several thousand miles, accomplished entirely on foot or by sea over a period of roughly 2 decades, in an age when the roads were the most dangerous places in the world. She was by any reasonable standard extraordinary, and she's almost entirely absent from the version of medieval history most of us learned in school. Let me back up slightly, because the story of women on medieval roads is not simply Marjorie Kempe's story. It is far older, far wider, and far more various than any single biography can contain. We have talked at length about who built the roads of medieval Europe, the serfs under obligation, the monks with plans and resources, the kings with armies, the merchants with salt and wool and iron. But here is the question I have been wanting to ask for a while now. Who actually used those roads day in and day out in the rhythms of ordinary medieval life? Not the armies, not the great merchants with their trains of pack animals, the ordinary people, the people whose journeys were local, practical, unremarkable, and largely unrecorded. And among those ordinary people in every region and every century of the medieval period were women. Women going to market a trip that might be 3 miles each way, carrying a basket of eggs or a bundle of cloth. Women travelling between villages to attend a family event, a wedding, a christening, a deathbed. Women making the short pilgrimages to local shrines that were the spiritual infrastructure of everyday medieval life. Not Jerusalem, just the chapel 2 villages away, where a local saint's relics were believed to cure a particular ailment. Women carrying messages between households, travelling to collect debts or pay them moving with their households when circumstances changed. Most of this travel left no record. It happened too frequently, too routinely for anyone to think it worth writing down. But it happened. The roads were full of women in exactly the same way that every road in every city in the world is full of women today. They have always been there. History just preferred to notice the men on horseback, but some women left records, and their records are some of the most vivid, most alive documents in all of medieval travel writing. Marjorie Kempe is perhaps the most famous and the most complicated. She was born around 1373 in King's Lynn, the daughter of a mayor and the wife of a merchant. By the time she began travelling, she was middle-aged, had survived the physical demands of bearing 14 children, had experienced what she described as divine visions, that led her to a radically devout life, and had negotiated with her husband successfully after some years of effort, an agreement of mutual celibacy that freed her to pursue her pilgrimages. The Book of Marjorie Kempe, dictated to a scribe because Marjorie was illiterate, is the first autobiography written in English. It is not primarily a travel account. Marjorie was more interested in documenting her visions and her complicated relationships with churchmen than in describing the landscape she passed through. But woven through it incidentally and unself-consciously is one of the most detailed accounts of what it actually felt like to be a woman travelling the roads and sea routes of medieval Europe. And what it felt like was frequently very uncomfortable. Her fellow pilgrims in Venice waiting for the ship to Jerusalem grew so annoyed with her constant weeping and her habit of lecturing them about Christ's suffering during meals that they refused to let her eat at the communal table. She had to find her own food, make her own arrangements. She was alone in a strange city, unable to speak Italian, managing without the social infrastructure that the group provided, because the group had decided she was more trouble than she was worth. She carried on. She got to Jerusalem. She climbed Mount Calvary. And when she came down, she wrote about it with the directness that still resonates across 600 years. She fell to the ground, she wrote, because the weight of what she felt was more than her body could hold upright. Now I want to make something very clear because I think it matters. Marjorie Kempe was not a typical medieval traveller. She was a mystic. She was driven by religious fervour of an intensity that unnerved the people around her, and she had access to financial resources from her family, from her husband, from the charity of people she encountered along the way that most medieval women did not possess. But the experience of the road itself, the practical physical day-to-day experience of being a woman moving through the medieval landscape, was something she shared with millions of women across the centuries whose names we will never know. The dangers were real. The chronicle of William the Conqueror's obituary in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written just after his death in 1087, praises his rule by saying that any man of substance could travel unmolested through England with his bosom full of gold. That phrase of substance is doing a lot of work, and notice that it says any man. The praise of a king who made road travel safe was inherently praise of safety for men with resources. Women travelling alone, or with only other women, occupied a different category of vulnerability. There is a scholarly consensus built from scattered court records and contemporary accounts that women travelling medieval roads faced elevated risks of robbery and harassment that men did not. This was not universal. The roads carried enormous numbers of women safely throughout the medieval period, but it was real, and medieval women knew it and managed it through a series of practical adaptations, travelling in groups, timing journeys to avoid certain road sections at dusk, paying for escort when possible, staying in monastic guest houses rather than public inns because the monastery offered not just shelter but also a degree of institutional protection, carrying credentials, a letter from a parish priest, evidence of a specific pilgrimage destination that framed the journey within a recognized, legitimate religious purpose, and therefore offered at least some social protection against the suspicion that a woman travelling alone might otherwise attract. And here at the intersection of female travel and pilgrimage, we find the most democratic and most extraordinary phenomenon in all of medieval road history. The pilgrimage was the one context in which a medieval woman from virtually any social background in virtually any region of Europe could travel long distances with a recognized, socially approved, legally protected purpose. The pilgrimage was the one road on which a woman's presence was not an anomaly requiring explanation. The Wife of Bath in Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, which, as you may know, is set on the pilgrimage road from Southwark to Canterbury in the 1380s, is described as an experienced traveller who has visited Rome, the shrine of the three kings at Cologne, Boulogne and Santiago de Compostela. 5 major pilgrimages. She's not unusual in the poem's universe. She's simply one pilgrim among 30. Chaucer published the Canterbury Tales around 1387 to 1400. He set it deliberately in the most democratically diverse space that medieval England contained a pilgrimage road. Where else could you find a knight, a miller, a prioress, a shipman, a merchant and a 5 times married woman from Bath, all travelling together as social equals, or near enough that the differences for the duration of the road became interesting rather than hierarchical? The road levelled things. Not entirely, not perfectly. The knight still outranked the miller. The wealthy still travelled on horseback while the poor went on foot. But the shared experience of the journey, the same weather, the same mud, the same hunger, by mid-afternoon, the same exhausted arrival at the inn created a temporary community that cut across the rigid social stratifications of the settled world. Let's spend a moment in the Tabard Inn, because the Tabard is real, and the world that surrounded it is one of the richest and most specific road environments in medieval history. The Tabard Inn was established around 1307 in Suffolk, on the south bank of the Thames, just outside the jurisdiction of the City of London, where the rules were more flexible and the population was more varied. It was built originally by the Abbot of Hyde Abbey in Winchester, as a place for the abbot and his ecclesiastical colleagues to stay when conducting business in London. Within a generation it had become something much more complicated, one of the primary gathering points for pilgrims preparing to travel the road to Canterbury, about 60 miles to the southeast. Its innkeeper in Chaucer's telling Harry Bailey was a real person. He appears in the historical record as an actual innkeeper and tax collector in Southwark in the 1380s. He is not a fictional convenience. He was there in that inn on that road doing exactly what Chaucer describes him doing, organising the chaos of 30-odd travellers from very different worlds into something that functioned as a temporary community. The inn itself stood exactly at the point where 2 ancient Roman roads, Stane Street and Watling Street, converged before crossing London Bridge. This was not a coincidence. Inns in medieval England located themselves precisely where roads intersected, where travellers had to slow down, and often needed to stop where the logic of the journey created a natural pause. The Tabard's location at the junction of 2 Roman roads at the gateway to London Bridge made it the most logically necessary overnight stop on the southern approach to London. Generations of travellers had been stopping in roughly that spot or nearby since the Romans paved Stane Street in the 1st century of the Common Era. By the 1380s, according to the Suffolk poll tax return of 1381, 3 years before Chaucer began writing the Canterbury Tales, 22 innkeepers were operating in Southwark alone. The public inn as an institution had expanded enormously in the decades following the Black Death of 1348. As the disruption of old social patterns and the movement of labour around England created an unprecedented amount of long-distance travel, by people who are not wealthy enough to stay in noble households or monastery guest chambers, but who nonetheless needed somewhere to sleep. The Tabard and inns like it along every major road in England were new institutions, genuinely new in the historical sense. Before roughly 1300, long-distance travel outside the nobility had largely relied on the hospitality of monasteries and the charity of households along the way. The public commercial inn was a medieval invention born out of the movement of people that the roads made possible and that commerce required. What was it actually like inside the Tabard on a spring evening in the 1380s? I want to try to give you a sensory picture, because history too often stays in the head when it should get into the body. The building would have been timber-framed with a central courtyard open to the sky where horses were stabled and carts unloaded. Around the courtyard, wooden galleries gave access to the upper rooms chambers, that were not individual rooms in any modern sense, but shared sleeping spaces where travellers might find themselves sharing a bed with strangers, or sleeping several to a room on straw mattresses depending on how full the house was and how much they could pay. The main hall where the tables were set for supper would have been smoky, the fire in the centre, the chimney imperfect, the rush-covered floor releasing the smell of trampled herbs, and the less romantic odours of a space that many animals and people pass through daily. The food was bread cheese pottage, a thick stew of whatever vegetables and grain were available, and on good days some form of roasted meat. The ale was warm and slightly sour and absolutely essential, because the water in and around London was not reliably safe to drink. Around the tables the knight who had just returned from campaigning travel-worn and modest. The prioress with her little dogs maintaining an air of delicacy that the setting made somewhat challenging. The miller drunk and loud and cheerful. The shipman with the weather-beaten look of someone who spent more time at sea than on land. The wife from Bath who had been here before multiple times, on multiple pilgrimages, and who knew exactly how much to pay for the horse fodder and exactly which innkeeper to avoid on the road ahead, and the author sitting in the corner watching, taking notes in his head, listening to the way these 30 strangers started cautiously and then less cautiously to tell each other their stories. Here is what strikes me most about the Canterbury Tales as a piece of road literature, something that I do not think gets said often enough. Chaucer was not writing a pilgrimage narrative. He was writing a road narrative. The destination, the shrine of Thomas Becket at Canterbury Cathedral, barely appears in the surviving text. The pilgrims never arrive. Chaucer died before he finished the work, and the 24 completed tales leave the travellers somewhere in the middle of their journey. But the road itself is everywhere. The mud, the weather, the exhaustion by mid-afternoon, the arguments between travellers who've been forced into proximity for days, and who are discovering, as people always do in forced proximity, exactly where their tolerances end. What Chaucer understood, and what I think is the deepest truth about the medieval road, is that the journey was the point, not the destination, not what you found at the end, but what you learned about the people around you and about yourself in the miles between. The road did not just connect places, it created experiences that could not happen anywhere else. The knight and the miller would never have sat at the same table in their settled lives. The wife of Bath's 5 marriages and her strong opinions about spousal equality would have been received very differently in a parish church than they were received on the road, where she was just another traveller, just another voice in the procession, just another person who needed to cross the same river at the same ford as everybody else. Marjorie Kempe was accused of heresy in England. The religious establishment found her public weeping, and her direct claims of divine communication threatening. On the road to Jerusalem, her fellow pilgrims abandoned her. In Rome, people mocked the white clothes she wore as a symbol of her spiritual marriage to God. But she kept walking, and she kept writing, or rather dictating, and the book of Marjorie Kempe survived, found in the 1930s in a private house in England after being lost for 400 years. We have it because she refused to stay home. We have it because the road, with all its mud and danger and exhaustion, and the indignity of being turned away from a communal dinner table by people who found her weeping inconvenient, the road was the only space available to her that was not entirely controlled by the world that wanted to keep her quiet. I keep thinking about that anonymous woman on the road to Cologne with a basket of preserved fish, and the woman walking to the market with eggs, and Marjorie Kempe falling on the ground at the top of Mount Calvary, and the wife of Bath who had done this 5 times and knew the road better than most of the men riding ahead of her. The road asked the same things of all of them. Cold mornings, uncertain weather, the possibility of a broken cart axle or a lame horse, or a flooded ford that had been perfectly passable the week before, and all of them kept going. Which is, when you think about it, what the roads have always been for. Not just getting somewhere, but the insistence repeated across centuries and miles and impossible circumstances that somewhere worth going to existed, and that the distance between here and there was a problem that could be solved by putting one foot in front of the other. We have spent most of our time on this journey talking about roads that were built, maintained and controlled by men, the serfs who dug the ditches, the lords who owned the land, the kings who controlled the bridges, the merchants who carried the salt. But there is one more set of builders we have not yet properly honoured, the people who, without any institutional authority or financial backing, built something even more essential than roads. They built the network of knowledge that made the roads usable, the monasteries, who mapped the routes, who kept the bridges, who maintained the guest houses at the intervals of a day's walk, who accumulated over centuries the quiet, unglamorous, extraordinarily important knowledge of how to move through a dangerous landscape safely. Their contribution to the roads of medieval Europe was larger than any king's and more durable than any emperor's, and it has its own remarkable story. 8,100 feet above sea level. That is where I want to take you right now, up where the air is thin, up where in October the first snows arrive and by November the path is buried under 10, sometimes 15 feet of white. Up at the top of the great St. Bernard Pass in the Pennine Alps on the border between what is now Switzerland and Italy, where for roughly 6 months of every year the world above the snow line is hostile to human life in ways that require no further elaboration. And yet someone decided to build a house there, not a temporary shelter, not a shepherd's summer hut, a hospice. A full permanent staffed heated provisioned hospice opened around the year 1050, sitting at the highest inhabited point in the Western Alps, specifically designed to welcome strangers who had been climbing for hours in conditions that could change without warning from merely brutal to genuinely life-threatening. The man who built it was Bernard of Menthon, the Archdeacon of Aosta. The problem he was solving was not subtle travellers crossing the Great St. Bernard Pass, the only reliable route through the Western Alps connecting northern Europe to Italy, were arriving at the summit terrorised, frostbitten, sometimes having watched companions collapse on the slope below them. The pass was also, as an additional complication, controlled by bandits who had made a reliable business out of waylaying travellers at the point of maximum vulnerability. Bernard's response was characteristically medieval in its ambition and its practicality. He built a house, he found monks to run it, he cleared the bandits by what exact means history is somewhat vague about, but the bandits were gone. And then his monks simply stayed there year after year through winters that would have ended most people's interest in the project very quickly, and they welcomed everyone who arrived. For free. I want to sit with that detail for a moment because it is easy to pass over it. The Great St. Bernard Hospice, for most of its medieval existence, charged travellers nothing. Nothing for the shelter, nothing for the food, nothing for the fire that warmed a body that had been cold for so many hours that warmth itself felt like a form of miracle. The monks were funded partly by the church, partly by donations from grateful former travellers, and partly by the endowments of wealthy patrons, who understood that maintaining the pass was a strategic necessity for anyone who needed to move armies' goods or ambassadors between northern Europe and Italy. The hospice was in the most precise sense infrastructure built and maintained by religious obligation, funded by private charity, operated by people who had chosen a life that most of us would find difficult to imagine choosing. And this, the Great St. Bernard Hospice, improbably located at 8,000 feet in the Alps, open to every exhausted traveller regardless of nationality, religion, or social status, was not exceptional. It was representative. The monastery network was the backbone of medieval road infrastructure in ways that we have never quite given it credit for. Let us step back and look at the larger picture, because the scale of what the Benedictine order alone built across medieval Europe is genuinely staggering. In the 6th century, an Italian monk named Benedict of Nursia wrote a document known as the Rule of St. Benedict. It was a set of practical guidelines for how a monastery should be organized, how monks should pray, eat, sleep, work, and relate to each other. It is not a long document. It is not in any obvious way a document about roads or hospitality or the management of travellers. But Chapter 53 of the Rule is titled simply, On the Reception of Guests. And it says this: all guests who arrive should be received as Christ, because Christ said, "I was a stranger and you welcomed me." No one who asks for hospitality at a monastery is to be turned away. The poor, the pilgrim, the sick, the weary traveller, all are to be received with the same care, the same food, the same shelter that would be extended to the most honoured of guests. That single chapter of a 6th century document became over the following centuries the legal and spiritual foundation for an extraordinary physical infrastructure. By the 10th and 11th centuries, the Rule of St. Benedict had been adopted by monasteries across France, Germany, England, Italy, Spain, and the Low Countries. The Benedictine order and its reform branches, the Cluniacs, the Cistercians, the Augustinians, had established hundreds of houses scattered across the medieval landscape, and every single one of those houses was, by the explicit command of the Rule, obligated to welcome travellers. Around the years 965 to 975, major English monasteries formally adopted something called the Regularis Concordia, the Agreement of the Rule. Among its specific requirements, each house was to feed 3 poor persons every day and to shelter travellers who arrived in need. 3 poor persons every day without exception, and travellers however many came. Think about the cumulative effect of that obligation applied to hundreds of monasteries spread across the landscape at intervals of roughly a day's walk along the major routes. If you were travelling from London to York, a journey of roughly 200 miles requiring 10 to 12 days on foot, you would, assuming you planned your route correctly, sleep inside or immediately outside a monastic house on every single night of that journey. Not in a ditch, not in a barn, not in the woods. In a building with walls and a fire and food maintained specifically for your arrival by people who regarded your presence as a spiritual opportunity rather than an inconvenience. This was not a luxury. In the medieval landscape we've been describing, with its forests and muddy roads and seasonal floods and endemic robbery, this network of guaranteed shelter was the difference between long-distance travel being possible and it being suicidal for ordinary people without resources. The Benedictine Abbey of Cluny in Burgundy, founded in the year 910, provides perhaps the most extreme illustration of what monastic hospitality could look like at its fullest development. By the 11th century, Cluny was the most powerful monastery in Europe. Its church was, until the construction of the new St. Peter's Basilica in Rome in the 16th century, the largest church in the Western world. Its network of dependent priories stretched across France, Spain, Italy, England, and Germany, and its resources for hospitality were by any contemporary standard lavish. Historical accounts suggest that by the early 11th century, Cluny could accommodate upwards of 70 guests simultaneously. Not guests who slept on the floor of the church porch, guests who were fed, given beds, and attended to by monks whose specific job was the management of hospitality. But Cluny was also the cautionary tale. By the 12th century, the monastery was, in the careful language of its own reform-minded critics, somewhat burdened by its generosity. The expense of feeding the constant stream of travellers, pilgrims, nobles, and ecclesiastical officials who descended on Cluny was significant enough that Abbot Peter the Venerable, writing around 1140, was already trying to renegotiate the terms of what the monastery owed to whom? Reading Abbey. in England found itself in debt from the pressure of travellers arriving at its gates. The Cluniac Priory at Bermondsey in London, situated just off the road between the city and the Channel, Ports described in period documents how its location made it almost impossibly popular as a stopping point to an extent that strained its finances badly. The solution at several major monasteries was the construction of a separate building outside the main abbey gates, a hospice for poorer travellers, distinct from the guest quarters within the abbey proper, where nobility and wealthy patrons were accommodated. The abbey managed 2 tiers of hospitality simultaneously, one for the influential and one for the ordinary, which is, if you think about it, a very medieval solution to a very modern problem. Here is something that I find genuinely delightful. The monk in charge of managing all of this was called the hostelarius, or in some orders the hospitarius, the hosteler. It was not a prestigious office. The hosteler at Worcester Cathedral Priory in the late 15th century earned an annual income of £4.15, one of the lower-ranking obedientiaries in the monastic hierarchy. He was responsible for the day-to-day management of arriving travellers, the allocation of beds, the provision of food, the care of horses, the organisation of the guest house. He was, in modern terms, the hotel manager of a medieval monastic inn that never closed and never charged admission. I find something quietly magnificent about this person, never celebrated, buried in the administrative records of a monastery that itself is barely mentioned in most history books, doing day after day the relentlessly practical work of making sure that the strangers who arrived exhausted at the gate found what they needed. The hosteler of Worcester, the hosteler of Reading, the hosteler of Bury St Edmunds, the hosteler of every monastery on every road in medieval Europe, for whom hospitality was not an inspiration but a shift, a daily obligation with beds to count and food to arrange and horses to stable before the next group arrived. But there is another dimension of the monastery's contribution to medieval roads that is even less celebrated than the hosteler, and that I think deserves its own moment. The monks mapped them. Not in the way we would recognise as cartography. Medieval Europe had nothing resembling accurate geographic maps until the very late medieval period, and even those were more symbolic than navigational. But monks accumulated over generations of receiving travellers from distant places and dispatching their own members on distant journeys, an extraordinary body of practical route knowledge. Matthew Paris, a 13th century monk at St Albans Abbey in England, compiled a series of itinerary maps showing the routes from London to the ports of southern England and from England to Rome. His maps are not accurate in the modern sense. Distances are distorted, the shapes of countries are wrong. But they are navigational tools of remarkable practical utility, because what they recorded was not geography as such, but the sequence of stopping points along major routes, the abbey here, the ford there, the bridge 3 miles after the town, the hospice at the base of the mountains. A traveller in the 13th century using Matthew Paris's itinerary would know before they left where they would sleep on each night of their journey, where the safe river crossings were, and roughly how long each day's walk would take. That knowledge did not come from surveying or measurement. It came from the accumulated experience of every traveller who had passed through St Albans, and from the Abbey's own institutional memory of every journey its members had made over the previous 200 years. The monastery was in this sense not just infrastructure, it was the library of road knowledge for the medieval world. I want you to think about what that means in the full sweep of the story we've been telling. The roads themselves were worn into the ground by repetition and need. The holloways of Dorset pressed 6 feet deep by 10,000 unremarkable journeys. The pilgrimage routes carved into the landscape by faith and suffering. The trade roads built by the practical logic of salt and fish and wool. But all of those roads were only usable if someone knew where they went. A road without knowledge of its route, its seasonal conditions, its dangerous sections and its safe ones, its reliable crossings and its flood-prone fords, a road without. That knowledge is just a scratch in the earth. It is the knowledge that makes it a road. And for most of the medieval period, that knowledge lived in monasteries. Here is the part that moves me most about this whole story. The Benedictine monks who staffed the great St. Bernard hospice at 8,000 feet in the Alps were not required to be there. Nobody held a sword to their throats. They chose that assignment in a system where the choice was real. They chose to spend their winters at one of the most inhospitable locations in Europe, warming fires and feeding strangers, and going out into blizzards to look for people who had not arrived when expected. Around the year 1700, the monks began breeding a specific kind of dog for this work. Large, calm, resistant to cold, with an extraordinary instinct for finding people buried in snow. These dogs would go out in pairs after a storm, one to find and stay with the buried traveller providing warmth, the other to return to the hospice and alert the monks to the location. A system so well organised, so reliable, that when Napoleon sent 250,000 soldiers through the pass between 1790 and 1810, not a single one of them was lost to the mountain. You know these dogs. Everyone knows these dogs. They have been cultural icons for 300 years. You have probably seen paintings of them with little barrels around their necks, which is, I should tell you, entirely fictional, a myth created by a 1920 painting by Edwin Landseer that captured the public imagination so completely that no amount of historical correction has been able to dislodge it. But the actual dogs were real. And what they represent a community that looked at one of the most dangerous roads in medieval Europe and decided methodically and over generations to build a system for making it safer, that is real. That is the monastery network. Not a spiritual abstraction, not a collection of peaceful places for prayer and contemplation, the nervous system of medieval travel, the accumulated knowledge of 1,000 years of movement through a difficult landscape, the people who kept the roads alive by knowing where they went and making sure that the stranger who arrived at the gate, exhausted and cold and sometimes barely conscious, found what they needed. Can I ask you something? When you think about the medieval period, do you imagine mostly darkness, mostly danger? The plague and the famine and the bandits and the bad roads and the 30 kilometers from your village to the edge of the known world. I understand why that image exists. There was darkness, there was danger, the roads were bad, the world was hard in ways that we have genuinely forgotten. But alongside all of that, running quietly through it, maintained by obligation and belief, and the particular kind of stubbornness that comes from thinking a thing matters, there was this. The fire in the hospice at 8,000 feet, the hostler at Worcester counting beds, Matthew Paris at his desk in St. Albans drawing a road he had never walked but knew from every person who had. The knowledge lived in human hands and human memory for 1,000 years of how to get from here to there. We have come a long way on this journey. We have walked the holloways, we have eaten salt, we have crossed the Alps, we have sat in the Tabard Inn and listened to 30 strangers tell each other stories. But there is one more mystery I have been holding back. The most counterintuitive part of this whole story. The part that connects the medieval road to the road outside your window in a way so direct, so immediate that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Medieval people were famously bad at knowing where they were. No maps worth navigating by, no signposts in most of Europe until very late in the period, no compasses except in maritime use, no reliable way to know standing at a crossroads in the middle of an English forest which of the 3 paths in front of you led to the town you needed to reach. And yet somehow they got where they were going, most of the time, more reliably than you might expect. How they did it? The art and the instinct and the remarkable embodied skill of wayfinding in a world without maps, that is where we're going next. Before we go any further, I want to show you something. In Hereford Cathedral in England there hangs a map, just one sheet of vellum calfskin essentially measuring roughly 5 feet by 4 feet. It was made around the year 1300, and it is the largest medieval map of the world that still survives anywhere on Earth. Here is the first thing that strikes you about it if you manage to see it. Jerusalem is in the centre. Not London, not Paris, not Rome. Jerusalem. East is at the top, west is at the bottom. And scattered across its surface in extraordinary detail are over 500 images, cities, rivers, mountains, biblical events, classical myths and creatures that the medieval mind regarded with complete seriousness. A unicorn, a headless being called a blemmy, whose face is located on its chest, a labyrinth labelled as such sitting somewhere near Crete. It is a magnificent document. It is in the deepest sense a window into how educated medieval Europeans understood the world. And here is the second thing that strikes you about it: you could not navigate with it. Not even a little. If you tried to use the Hereford Mappa Mundi to find your way from Hereford to London, you would be lost within the first mile, because that is not what it was made for. The Mappa Mundi was not a road map. It was a theological document, a cosmological statement, a visual sermon in calfskin about the Christian understanding of history, creation and salvation. The point, if I had to state it simply, is this medieval people had a concept of the world that was grand and cosmic and beautifully organized in spiritual terms, and they had absolutely no useful tool for finding their way from the crossroads outside their village to the market town 3 valleys over. So how did they do it? This is the question that has always sat at the back of this entire story, and I want to spend some real time with it tonight. The absence of navigational maps in medieval Europe was not a problem that people were struggling to solve. It was simply the condition of the world. Nobody expected maps in the way we do. The cognitive architecture of medieval travel was built on entirely different foundations, and those foundations were in their own way just as sophisticated as anything we have invented since. The first foundation was human memory. Not personal memory, not the memory of an individual traveller, but something closer to what scholars today call distributed cognition knowledge, that exists not in any single mind, but in the collective awareness of a community. Every medieval village, every market town, every monastic house sat at the centre of a web of locally known routes. The shepherd knew every path within a 10-mile radius of his home farm, with the intimacy that comes from walking the same ground in every weather across 30 years. The miller knew the river crossing downstream and the one upstream. The alewife in the market town knew which road into the hills became impassable in October and which was firm all year. The parish priest had walked the routes to neighbouring villages on pastoral visits so many times that he navigated them half asleep. None of this knowledge was written down. It was carried in the body, encoded in muscle memory in the accumulated experience of thousands of individual journeys, in stories exchanged at market stalls and at inn tables, and across parish church pews. When a traveller arrived in an unfamiliar village and asked the way, they are plugging into this distributed system, drawing on a collective geographic memory that no single person possessed in full, but that taken together, covered the landscape with extraordinary density. Scholars who study medieval wayfinding describe what happened at a crossroads with a phrase I find particularly useful. The traveller inhabited the landscape sequentially, not spatially. Modern navigation is spatial. We see ourselves from above the bird's-eye view of the map, the satellite image, the GPS screen showing the dot that is you moving across the grid. We understand where we are in relation to where we want to go, because we can see both places simultaneously plotted on a single surface. Medieval navigation was sequential. You did not need to know where you were in relation to your destination in any abstract geometric sense. You needed to know the next landmark, and then the one after that, and then the one after that. Go to the oak tree where 3 roads meet. Take the road that runs toward the tower of the church in the valley. Follow it until you cross the stone bridge over the small river. After the bridge, look for the mill. From the mill, it is 2 hours' walk to the gate of the town. That is a medieval direction, not a coordinate, not a distance measured in miles. A sequence of recognizable objects in the landscape strung together like beads on a string, each one pointing to the next. The phrasebook Manière de Langage, written in English and French around the year 1396, gives us an extraordinary window into exactly this kind of navigation. It contains sample conversations for English travellers in France, including a section on asking for directions that records in dialogue form the actual language people used. The exchanges are not abstract discussions of geography. They are practical negotiations: which road, which landmark, how far, where to stop for the night. A fragment preserved in the British Library shows a traveller asking a local, "Is this the road to such a city? How many miles? Is it safe? Where shall I lodge?" The local answers in the same sequential landmark-anchored language: "Follow this road. Past the village of such a name, at the church turn right. The next town is perhaps half a day on foot." This was the lingua franca of medieval navigation, not geography, but sequence, not distance, but duration, not location, but the next known thing. There is something in this that I find almost meditative if you give it a moment. Medieval travellers experienced space as a series of encounters rather than as a geometric field. They did not abstract their position from above. They were immersed in the landscape, moving through it one step at a time, oriented not by a map in their hand, but by the relationships between the things they could see with their eyes. The church tower in the distance, the river on the left, the particular shape of a hill that the locals had a name for. This is, as it happens, an extraordinarily ancient way of knowing a landscape. It predates literacy, predates writing, predates maps by thousands of years. The sequential landmark-anchored navigation of the medieval traveller is not some inferior substitute for modern cartography. It is the original human system for moving through space, refined over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, and it works extraordinarily well in familiar territory and well enough in unfamiliar territory, if you ask the right questions of the right people. The weakness of the system is exactly what you would expect it breaks down when the knowledge is not there to be accessed. The desert with no landmarks, the open sea with nothing but sky, the unfamiliar mountain range where every valley looks like every other valley. In those conditions, sequential landmark navigation fails completely, and medieval travellers knew it. The ship that was out of sight of land needed the stars. The pilgrim crossing the high Alps needed a guide who'd been that way before. And that is exactly what they used. The guide was one of the most important figures in medieval travel, and one of the most thoroughly forgotten. Not a professional guide in any modern sense, not a licensed tour operator with a lanyard and a microphone. Simply someone who had been where you needed to go and who was willing to take you there or tell you in enough detail how to follow their route. The professional guide was common enough on dangerous or complex routes that medieval court documents, estate accounts, and travel records mention the payment of guides regularly. A royal household travelling to an unfamiliar region would hire local knowledge. An army advancing through difficult terrain would pay scouts who knew the country. A merchant making a first crossing of the Alps would attach himself to a convoy of experienced traders who knew the pass. And in less formal contexts, the ordinary traveller's primary navigational resource was simply the next person they met on the road. In a world where most people stayed close to home, anyone who had recently come from the direction you were heading was a walking route description. You stopped them. You asked. They told you what they knew about the next 10 miles. You stored it. You moved on. Medieval scholars who have studied the phrase books and travel literature of the 14th and 15th centuries point out something fascinating. The questions medieval travellers asked were not about geography in any general sense. They were almost always about one specific next step. Not, how do I get to Rome, but, is the road beyond the river safe at this time of year? Not, what is the best route to the coast, but, is there a ford before nightfall, or must I wait for the ferry? The horizon of medieval navigation was about 12 miles, roughly half a day's walk. Beyond 12 miles, knowledge tended to grow unreliable. Travellers planned their day to that scale, solving the problem of the next 12 miles, rather than the problem of the whole journey. Now I want to spend a moment on something that I think illuminates the whole medieval travel experience in a way that nothing else quite does. Getting lost. Not as a metaphor. Literally getting lost. Taking the wrong road, ending up somewhere you did not intend to be, having to backtrack or improvise, or simply make the best of being in the wrong place entirely. Getting lost was a normal, accepted part of medieval travel. It was not a disaster in the way it might be today, standing on an empty highway at midnight with a dead phone, and no idea which direction the nearest town lies. It was an inconvenience, sometimes a serious one, but it was also simply something that happened to travellers the way rain happened to travellers, or the way the inn was already full when you arrived, or the way your horse threw a shoe on a road with no blacksmith within 5 miles. Medieval travellers planned for being lost in the same practical way they planned for bad weather. You left early enough that you had room to take a wrong turn and correct it. You carried food for an extra day. You memorized not just the route to your destination, but the name of the nearest large town in every direction, so that if you found yourself entirely at sea, you could at least orient towards something you knew how to ask for. And crucially, you asked. Constantly, repeatedly, without embarrassment, you stopped everyone you encountered and you asked where you were. The modern traveller's reluctance to ask for directions is, among other things, a product of having alternatives. The phone, the GPS, the map app that will recalculate your route regardless of how comprehensively you've bungled it. The medieval traveller had no alternatives. Asking was not an admission of failure, it was the primary technology of navigation. The person who refused to ask for directions was not independent and self-sufficient. They were lost. Can I ask you something that might seem slightly odd at this time of night? When was the last time you were genuinely uncommittedly lost, not the momentary GPS confusion of not knowing which exit to take, but truly uncertain of where you were and how to get where you were going? And if you have been there recently, do you remember what you did? Who you asked, how you pieced together the information? How satisfying it was when the landscape finally started to make sense again, when you could see where you were in relation to where you needed to be. That experience, that particular combination of disorientation and recovery of depending on a stranger's knowledge to navigate, was the daily texture of travel for virtually every person who moved through the medieval landscape. They were in this sense permanently in the state you were in the last time your phone died in an unfamiliar neighbourhood, permanently dependent on the knowledge of the people around them, permanently navigating by landmark and by asking by the next church tower and the next person on the road. And yet they got where they were going, most of the time. There were aids, let me be clear about that. Medieval travellers were not entirely thrown back on bare memory and the willingness of strangers to stop and talk. The itinerary, a written list of stopping points compiled by someone who had previously made the journey, was the closest thing to a navigational document that most medieval travellers used. Not a map, a list. Places in order with notes about distances measured not in miles but in days or half-days of travel. Sometimes with notes about the quality of roads, the reliability of fords, the location of hospitable monasteries or trustworthy innkeepers. The itinerary tradition was ancient. It goes back at least to the 4th century when a Christian pilgrim from Bordeaux compiled a list of stopping points on the route to Jerusalem, the earliest surviving written pilgrimage itinerary. By the 13th and 14th centuries, itineraries for the major routes, the Via Francigena, the Camino routes, the major English roads between the cathedral cities, circulated among travellers as manuscript documents, shared and copied and updated by successive users who added their own observations in the margins. Matthew Paris's itinerary maps, which we touched on in our previous section, were unusual precisely because they had a visual component, a linear diagram of the route with stopping points drawn along it rather than a pure list. But they were still sequential documents read top to bottom along a line not spatially in the way we read modern maps. The traveller did not look at a Matthew Paris map to see where they were in relation to the whole route. They used it to identify the next stopping point and the one after that. The experience of using a medieval itinerary was something like following written stage directions. You were always on a specific line moving from one mark to the next, with the rest of the script existing only as possibility. One more thing, and I think it might be my favourite detail in this entire long story. In the 14th century, someone we do not know who compiled a small book in English and French called a phrase manual for travellers. It was a practical guide to the conversations an English speaker might need to have while travelling in France. How to ask for food, how to bargain with an innkeeper, how to request medical assistance, and yes, how to ask for directions. What strikes me about the direction section is not the content, which is exactly what you might expect. What strikes me is the tone. The manual assumes, as a matter of course, that the traveller will be asking for directions regularly, that they will not understand the first answer, and that they will need to ask again. It provides not one set of direction-asking phrases, but several different ways of phrasing the same essential question. Because the person you ask might speak a different regional dialect, might be in a hurry, and give a short answer, might give you landmarks that mean nothing to you. The document understood, in other words, that asking for directions was not a single act that solved the navigation problem. It was an ongoing, collaborative, iterative process between the traveller and the landscape, and the people who knew it. That is, I think, a profound insight. Not about medieval travel specifically, but about how human beings actually navigate space. Not from above, not abstractly, not alone, but in conversation, in collaboration. One landmark at a time, one question at a time, one stranger at a time, until the familiar shape of the destination finally comes into view. Something is crystallizing, I think, in this story. Something that connects the holloway worn 6 feet deep by 10,000 ordinary journeys to the scholar standing at the crossroads, asking which road leads to the market town, to the monk preserving the itinerary at St. Albans, to the woman in white clothes falling on the ground at the top of Mount Calvary. All of it. Every road, every bridge, every question, every answer, every landmark burned into someone's memory by the simple act of passing it 100 times. All of it was human. Not engineering, not politics, not theology, even though theology ran through much of it. Just human beings wanting to get somewhere and doing what was necessary to make the getting there possible. There is one more dimension of this story left. The dimension that brings everything home quite literally. The roads that are still under our feet. The ways that medieval people built into the landscape that we still use without knowing it. The extraordinary continuity between the world they made and the world we move through every day. That is where we're headed next, and the ending, I promise, is going to surprise you. Pull up Google Maps right now, or just picture it in your mind if you'd rather keep your eyes closed. Type in Old Kent Road, London. You'll find what looks like a completely ordinary South London street. A bit shabby, honestly, a few discount shops, some kebab houses, the kind of road that feels unremarkable from every angle. Nothing about it suggests anything beyond the mundane present. But here is what is buried under that tarmac. Under the pavement of Old Kent Road lies a stretch of Watling Street, one of the oldest roads in Britain. Watling Street was already ancient when the Romans arrived in 43 of the Common Era. The Romans paved it, widened it to approximately 7.5 to 8.5 metres, and turned it into the primary route connecting the channel ports of Kent to the Roman city of Londinium. Archaeologists dating the London portion found evidence of construction in the winter of 47 to 48 of the Common Era, and evidence of two major resurfacings before Boudicca's uprising burned London in 60 or 61. The road that is now Old Kent Road has been in continuous use in one form or another for somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 years, and the number 53 bus runs along it every day. I promised you an ending that would surprise you. This is it. Not the drama of a battle or the fall of an empire, something quieter and in some ways more astonishing. The medieval roads did not disappear. They are not relics. They are not museum pieces. They are, in thousands of cases across Europe, the actual roads. You travel on the actual streets. You walk down the actual alignments your city followed when it decided where to put the buildings. The medieval past is not behind us in this story. In a very specific physical, measurable sense, it is under our feet. Here is the scale of it in England alone, and it is genuinely staggering once you sit with it. The A5 road, a major modern highway running from London all the way to the coast of North Wales, follows the line of Watling Street for the majority of its length. The A10, heading north from London through Shoreditch and Stoke Newington, follows Ermine Street, the Roman road to York. The A2 from London toward Dover follows the line of the same ancient road that Julius Caesar's troops used when they advanced inland from the coast. The A46, running through the English Midlands, follows the Fosse Way, a Roman road that was itself built along or near prehistoric trackways that were already centuries old when Rome arrived. These are not archaeological coincidences. They are the product of a very simple principle. Good roads once made tend to stay. A route that has been used heavily for 500 years has been so thoroughly integrated into the landscape, the towns that grew along it, the bridges built to cross the rivers. It needed to cross the settlements that positioned themselves to serve its traffic, that the thought of redirecting that route somewhere else becomes unthinkable. The landscape itself is organized around the road. The road and the landscape are by this point indivisible. Medieval England, in other words, made the same calculation that all previous road builders had made work with what you have. The Roman roads were there. They had good alignments. The bridges were mostly passable. The settlements already existed at the right intervals. You repaired what was repairable, you built where you needed to build, and you accepted that the basic grid of the country was inherited. We are still using that inherited grid every day. But London, if you want a city where the medieval road network is most vividly alive under the modern surface, London is the place to look. The medieval city grew up not on a blank slate, but on top of the Roman city of Londinium, which itself had organised around a pattern of roads radiating out from the bridgehead at London Bridge. That bridgehead, the single crossing point of the Thames, for most of London's history was the hub from which everything else radiated. Roads came into it from the south, roads left from it going north. The city's whole spatial logic was anchored to the fact that here at this point on the river, you could cross. Medieval London did not redesign that logic. It inherited it. The streets of the medieval city followed the lines of Roman streets underneath them, the lines of Roman streets following in some cases lines laid down by earlier British tracks. The street called Lombard Street in the old financial heart of London preserves in its very name and in its physical alignment a medieval identity that connects it directly to the community of Italian merchants from Lombardy who settled there in the 12th and 13th centuries, bringing with them the banking and credit practices that would eventually become the foundations of modern finance. A street name is not just a label, it is a compressed history. Fleet Street named for the Fleet River that once ran through it. Cheapside from the Old English word siep, buying and selling, that gave us our word cheap, and that marked the main marketplace of medieval London. Milk Street, Bread Street, Honey Lane, all off Cheapside, all named for the produce that was sold there in the medieval market stalls, Threadneedle Street, where the tailors worked, Cordwainer Street, where the shoemakers were. These names are not decorative history. They're the direct record of a medieval economic geography that organized itself along specific streets, and that gave those streets their identities so thoroughly that 700 years of subsequent history has never fully dissolved the memory. Walk through the financial district of London today, and you are walking through a medieval market town that has never quite stopped being exactly what it was. The buildings are different, the people are different, the scale is almost incomprehensibly different. The medieval city housed perhaps 70 to 80,000 people at its medieval peak. The modern city of London hosts over 500,000 workers every weekday. But the street pattern, the relationship between the narrow lanes and the wider thoroughfares, the way the old road lines from the Roman and medieval period still dictate where the buildings can go and where the pedestrians flow, that is medieval. And this is not unique to London. In Rome, the Via del Governo Vecchio follows the line of a Roman road that was itself part of the urban infrastructure of the ancient city. In Paris, the Rue Saint-Jacques, one of the oldest streets in Paris, running straight from the Seine toward the city's southern exit, was in the medieval period the beginning of the great pilgrimage road to Santiago de Compostela. The pilgrims who set off from Paris for Spain, in their hundreds of thousands across the medieval centuries, began their journeys on the very street that is now lined with bookshops and cafes and Saturday morning students from the nearby Sorbonne. In Siena, the medieval city's Y-shaped street plan, the reason Siena developed the particular three-hill form that makes it one of the most dramatically beautiful medieval townscapes in the world was directly determined by its position on the Via Francigena. The three hills of Siena sat at the junction of routes converging from three directions along the medieval road network. The city grew outward along those three roads. The streets in the centre are still the old Via Francigena alignments. The great hospital of Santa Maria della Scala, which was established in the 9th century specifically to care for travellers on the Via Francigena, still stands on the same site, still opposite the cathedral, still architecturally magnificent, now a museum housing one of the most remarkable fresco cycles in medieval art. The medieval road made Siena. The medieval road made the hospital that made the city wealthy enough to build the cathedral. The medieval road is why those frescoes exist, and the medieval road is still under its modern cobblestones exactly where it always was. Can I ask you something that I have been sitting with of this entire journey? If you knew that the street outside your building or a street in the nearest city followed a path that had been in continuous use for 500 or 1,000 or 2,000 years, would you walk it differently? Not more carefully, not more slowly necessarily, but differently, with some awareness of the accumulated weight of all the feet that had gone before you. The Roman legionary marching to the frontier, the medieval salt merchant hauling his cart in the autumn mud, the pilgrim in her worn leather shoe staff in hand headed somewhere she believed was worth reaching. I think about this sometimes when I'm in an old city. The feeling of a street that is very old, not the buildings which may be new, but the street itself, the alignment, the particular angle at which two roads meet, is one that I find genuinely difficult to describe. It is not exactly like touching history, it is more like being inside it. Discovering that history is not a thing that happened in the past, but a thing that continues to happen in the ground, in the alignments of roads, in the names of streets and the positions of bridges. There is one more story I need to tell you, and it is the one that I think brings everything together most beautifully. In the year 1985, a Galician priest named Elias Valina San Pedro picked up several cans of yellow paint and began walking the route of the Camino Frances, the French way, the main medieval road to Santiago de Compostela. He had spent years studying the medieval pilgrim route, tracing its path through documents and monastery records, and the surviving evidence in the landscape. And now he was doing something that at the time seemed slightly eccentric. He was painting yellow arrows on rocks, on walls, on fence posts, on the sides of buildings. Any surface that a walker would see at a crucial decision point, a junction, a confusing fork in the path, a place where the medieval route departed from the obvious modern road, he painted a small yellow arrow. In 1985, 1,245 people walked the Camino to Santiago. In 1993, after years of those yellow arrows accumulating along the route, over 100,000 people completed the walk. In 2023, 446,000 people received their Compostela certificate at the cathedral in Santiago, the formal proof of having completed the pilgrimage issued by the cathedral to anyone who walks the last 100 kilometers. In 2025, that number surpassed 530,000, the highest single-year total in the history of the Camino medieval or modern. The medieval road, marked by one man with yellow paint cans, had come back to life, not as a curiosity, not as a historical reenactment, as a living, breathing, growing thing walking on its own legs at a rate the medieval world would have recognized immediately. And the people walking it today, the American retirees, the Korean students, the German families, the Brazilian athletes, the Irish pensioners, the young Australians who saved up for a year to make the journey. They are not walking a recreation of a medieval path. They are walking the medieval path, the same route, the same hills, the same valleys, the same river crossings in the same places for the same reason the crossings existed in the first place, because this is where the water was manageable. The ground has not changed, only the people on it. Here is what I keep coming back to in the final stretch of this story. We began a long time ago now with a continent in pieces, with Rome fallen roads, silent forests closing in villages cut off from each other by mud and distance, and the patient encroachment of the wilderness. We began with the question of how a civilization rebuilds its connections after losing them, and with the uncomfortable discovery that the rebuilding happened not through grand design, but through the accumulated choices of millions of ordinary people, none of whom were thinking about building a civilization. They were thinking about getting somewhere. The salt merchant needed to reach the market before his cargo began to absorb moisture. The pilgrim needed to reach the shrine before winter closed the mountain passes. The farmer's wife needed to get to the next village and back before dark. The drover needed to keep his cattle moving through the landscape without them scattering. None of them were thinking about infrastructure. None of them were thinking about the long arc of history. They were thinking about the next 12 miles, the next ford, the next landmark, the next question to ask the next person they met on the road. And out of all of those specific, practical, humble choices accumulated over not decades but centuries, came something that outlasted the people who made it, outlasted the societies that organized it, outlasted the very languages in which those people thought and argued and told each other stories. At the end of the day, the road, still here, under your feet if you're anywhere near an old city, in the names of the streets you walk, in the alignments of the highways you drive, in the yellow arrows on a Galician fence post pointing the same direction they have pointed in one form or another for 1,100 years. We're almost at the end of this journey. There is one more thing to say, one final reflection, that I have been saving because I think it might be the most important thought in this whole long story. It is a thought about what roads are at the deepest level, not the engineering, not the history, not the politics or the commerce or the faith. Something more fundamental than any of those, what a road actually is, and what it says about us, the people who make them and keep making them in every age against every obstacle, as though the making of paths between places we love and places we need is not just practical necessity, but something closer to the deepest expression of what we are. What is a road really? Not the engineering answer. Not the historical one, Not the political or the commercial or the theological version we have spent the last many hours exploring together. What is it at the very core of it? When you strip away every other layer, the corvée labour, the pilgrim's prayer, the salt merchant's calculation, the king's strategic ambition. What remains? I have been circling this question for a long time, and I think the answer is deceptively simple. A road is proof that someone else went this way before you. That is all. Nothing more and nothing less. When you step onto any road anywhere in the world, whether it is a paved motorway or a dirt track in a Tuscan hillside or a hollow lane in Dorset, sunk 6 feet below the surrounding fields, you're stepping into evidence. Evidence that human beings have been here moving through this particular piece of ground, in this particular direction, for reasons that seemed important to them. You're stepping into a community that has no edges in time. Every person who ever walked that road before you is in some small sense still there. Their choice this way, not that way, encoded in the ground you walk on. I find that thought genuinely quietly astonishing, and I wanted to share it with you before we say goodnight. Throughout this entire journey I've noticed something. The stories that stayed with me most were not the grand ones, not the Roman Empire with its 85,000 kilometers of stone roads, not William the Conqueror repositioning an entire kingdom like pieces on a board, not the Hanseatic League that began as a road maintenance agreement and ended up negotiating with kings. The stories that stayed with me were the small ones. Thomas, our invented Thomas the Serf, who packed hard bread on a Tuesday morning and went to repair the market road instead of tending his barley. He never owned the road. He never chose to build it. He never received a penny for the days he gave to it. But it was there because of him. The holloway in Dorset that sank to a depth of 20 feet, not because anyone dug it, but because enough people walked it over centuries because they needed to get somewhere, and this was the way. The shepherd in the Pyrenees at the top of the mountain pass watching a man emerge from the fog on the Spanish side, not a soldier, not a merchant, just a man with a walking staff and blisters, and the quiet look of someone who has come a very long distance and does not quite believe he has made it. Marjorie Kempe falling on the ground at the top of Mount Calvary with the weight of what she felt more than her body could hold upright. The road did not make that possible for her. The road made it possible for her to get there. Here is something I've come to believe after all of this. The history of roads is not really a history of engineering or politics or religion or commerce. It is a history of human stubbornness. The absolute unwavering, apparently ineradicable human insistence that isolation is not acceptable. That the person on the other side of the forest, the other side of the river, the other side of the mountain range is worth reaching. That whatever is over there, salt or a saint's bones or a family member or a market or simply somewhere different from here, is worth the cold and the mud and the bandits and the probability of getting lost and the very real possibility of not coming back. Every road ever made was an act of defiance against the landscape, against the raw, indifferent fact of distance. Look at how far it is. The landscape says this through its forests and its rivers and its mountain passes and its spring mud seasons. Look at how far it is and how dangerous and how uncertain. And generation after generation the answer has been the same. We know. We're going anyway. I want to tell you about one specific walk that happened about 5 years ago in England because I think it captures something about this better than anything I could construct. A small group of researchers and walking enthusiasts attempted to trace the route of an old medieval drover's road through Wales and into England, a route that had not been formally walked or documented in over a century. They had old maps, they had historical records, they had the occasional surviving stretch of sunken track and an ancient boundary marker here and there. Most of the route had been absorbed into modern farmland built over redirected by drainage projects, or simply lost under 200 years of agricultural change. And yet it was still there, not as a physical track in most places, but as a pattern in the landscape. The route made sense. Every few miles there was a reason, a ford, a ridge, a narrowing of the valley that explained why people would have walked exactly there and not 20 feet to the left or right. The land itself still contained the logic of the road, even after the road itself had vanished. They found sections of preserved track in unexpected places under the canopy of an old wood, where the trees had grown up on either side of the way and enclosed it in green shadow. Along the back of a farm where the boundary hedges still followed the old route's line. At a river crossing where the ford was still faintly visible as a slight smoothness in the river stones worn by centuries of cattle hooves. The road had not been maintained. Nobody had been responsible for it for over 100 years, and yet it was recognizable, still legible, still in its quiet, overgrown way there, because the landscape had remembered. Think about all the forces that tried over the centuries to erase the roads of medieval Europe. Time, weather, vegetation, the indifference of subsequent generations who had no particular memory of why a certain path ran where it ran. Political reorganizations that redesigned territories and made old routes irrelevant. Economic shifts that moved the centers of gravity away from the towns the roads had served. Plague which emptied the villages that maintained them. Wars which deliberately destroyed them. All of that. Century after century of entropy, neglect, and active erasure. And still the roads are there, in the yellow arrows on the fence posts along the Camino Frances, in the alignments of the London streets that follow Roman lines laid down nearly 2,000 years ago, in the holloways of Dorset as dark and deep and quiet now as they were when someone first pressed their feet into that sandstone 800 years ago. In the route from Canterbury to Rome that Archbishop Sigaric walked in 990, and that over 500,000 people walked in 2025, following the same stopping points, crossing the same rivers, climbing the same passes. Roads, it turns out, are among the most persistent things human beings make. More persistent than the buildings alongside them. The buildings collapse, the walls crumble, the stone gets recycled into newer construction. But the line of the road, the simple spatial fact that this is how you get from here to there, that persists in a way that almost nothing else does. I want to read you something, not from a history book, and not from a medieval chronicle, but from the land itself. A kind of message that the accumulated roads have been carrying for centuries without anyone noticing it was a message. Every path that exists was made by a choice. And every choice to take a certain path taken again by the next person, and the next over enough time becomes a fact. A permanent alteration of the landscape. An evidence that this direction mattered, that this connection was worth making, that the distance between here and there was not going to be allowed to stand as the final word. That is not just road engineering. That is not just medieval history. That is something very old and very human, operating in every period, in every culture, on every landscape that people have ever moved through. The road says you are not alone here. Others came this way. Others are coming after you. The distance is bridgeable. The isolation is not permanent. Keep walking. And now we're at the end of our journey. We began in the silence after Rome. We walked through the mud of 1,000 forgotten Tuesday mornings. We heard the feet of pilgrims on the cobblestones of northern Spain, and the hooves of salt merchants' horses on the roads of Lüneburg. We stood in the holloway in Dorset with the tree roots hanging above us and the compressed darkness of 1,000 years of footsteps around us. We ate hard bread with Thomas the Serf and sat by the fire in the Tabard Inn with Chaucer's pilgrims. We climbed the great St. Bernard Pass and felt the thin alpine air and the particular quality of silence at 8,000 feet. We got lost comfortably, expectedly, navigably lost somewhere in a medieval English forest, and we found our way out again one landmark at a time, one question asked at a crossroads, one stranger's patient answer carrying us forward, And then we walked back out into the modern world and found it there, the medieval road still under our feet, still doing exactly what it was always meant to do. Connecting things, connecting people, connecting the person standing on Old Kent Road in London this morning, waiting for the number 53 bus to the ancient Briton, who first pressed a path through the forest toward what would become Canterbury 3,000 years ago. A connection they do not know about and did not choose, and that exists whether they know it or not in the ground under their shoes. I have one last thought for you, and then I will let you sleep. The medieval people who built these roads, the serfs, the monks, the pilgrims, the merchants, the drovers, the salt carriers, the women who walked to market with their eggs, they were not building for posterity. They were not thinking about us. They were building for the next market day, the next harvest season, the next pilgrimage, the next need. And yet here we are, sleeping above their roads, driving along the lines they walked, walking on the stones they laid and the paths they pressed into the earth, the very landscape rearranged however slightly by their passage. Every road is a form of gift from people who had no idea they were giving it. Every path that persists is a conversation across time from someone who needed to get somewhere once to everyone who will need to get there again. I think that is something worth knowing, worth sitting with as you drift off to sleep tonight. The roads under your feet are not just asphalt and concrete. They are the accumulated decisions of people who, in the face of distance and difficulty, and every possible reason to stay where they were, chose to move, chose to connect, chose to make the getting from here to there a little easier for whoever came after. That is what a road is, and it is, when you think about it, one of the most generous things human beings have ever made. Thank you. I mean that genuinely and deeply. Not just for watching or listening tonight, but for staying this whole long way. For walking with me through the mud and the maps and the holloways and the alpine passes and the lantern-lit inns, for being interested in the salt merchants and the serfs and the monks with their yellow-painted fence posts, and the woman who fell on the ground at the top of a mountain because the weight of where she was and how far she'd come was more than she could hold standing upright. If any part of this story stayed with you, if you find yourself looking differently at a street name this week, or wondering about the road under the road under the road, or feeling some flicker of kinship with the anonymous thousands who moved through the medieval landscape and made it into the world we live in, then this journey was worth every mile. And if you have been here from the very beginning of this story, from the silence after Rome to this last quiet thought before sleep, then I want you to know that this is exactly the kind of company I hope to keep tonight. Rest now. The road will still be there in the morning, and I will be here when the next story finds me. Another long night, another set of doors to open into the past, another question about who we are and where we came from, and what the people before us were really like when you get past the dates and the battles and the kings and sit down in the ordinary moments of ordinary lives. There is always another road to walk. I will see you there. Good night.